This week's episode is brought to you by Audible, the leading provider of spoken word entertainment and audiobooks, featuring thousands of titles across all genres, ranging from bestsellers to celebrity memoirs, news, business, and self-development. Every month, members get 1 credit to pick any title, plus 2 Audible originals from a monthly selection, and access to daily news digests, in addition to various podcast episodes as well, such as the Goop Podcast and even Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend. Sign up for Audible today and get your free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial by going to audibletrial.com/InSessionFilm. Once again, Audible is offering a 30-day free trial and a free audiobook download if you sign up at audibletrial.com/InSessionFilm, and we thank Audible for their support.
Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to episode 518 for January 23rd, 2023, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Thanks for joining us this week, everybody. Brendan, oftentimes here on the show, we talk about this little thing called hashtag JD Tears, and we make fun of my emotional vulnerabilities, we'll say. I'm not saying that I'm going to indulge in the hashtag JD Tears on the show, but it is very possible.
We'll call this episode, we'll call it Inside JD Tears, is what we're going to call it.
That is absolutely perfect because, and this is a little bit twofold, as Brendan was alluding to there, we are doing a 2013 retrospective, and for long-time listeners, you'll know, but to reiterate for any new listeners out there, we launched InSession Film back in January of 2013.
Yep.
We are on the heels of our 10th year anniversary, and it felt fitting for a couple of reasons to do a 2013 retrospective this week.
Yeah.
We're going to review Inside Llewyn Davis and then discuss our top 10 movies of 2013. And I'm very, very excited for it, not just because these films are turning 10 years old, which is a significant milestone in its own right.
Gosh, we're old. We're so old now.
I know. But this couldn't be more serendipitous. The timing of this retrospective is impeccable because this week's show, episode 518, is the end of an era.
We're closing up shop. We no longer exist.
No, we are transitioning into a new one. This will be the last episode of the InSession Film Podcast as you know it to be. And I'll admit, I'm a little sentimental at the moment since we've been doing it this way for a decade now.
I know, yeah. Sometimes change is good. Sometimes you think it's bad until it becomes good.
Absolutely. And I'm feeling that especially because we're coupling it with the nostalgia of this 2013 retrospective and looking at a crop of films we covered in our first year. And that first year is always a little special.
Yeah.
However, and this leads me to the big announcement we teased on social media over the weekend. As I noted, tonight is the end of an era, and that includes Extra Film. I've loved Extra Film. It's something we also launched in 2013, not long after we began the main show, because we wanted this extra space to talk about other movies that we didn't have time for here on the main show.
Right.
And that was something Brendan and I did for quite a long time. And then back in 2018, Ryan and Jay ended up taking over that show and they made it their own. And they did such a great job. The last 5 years have been absolutely terrific. But starting next week, we are moving into the next phase of InSession Film as the main show and Extra Film will be combining into one show.
I was just going to say, first off, JD, when you open up by saying extra film is essentially going away, I'm sure our listeners are like, where are Jay and Ryan going?
Yeah.
Are you firing them?
No, quite the opposite.
You certainly formed that in a way that could have scared a lot of people.
Maybe. I was certainly trying to build a little suspense. But yes, starting next week, you will hear Ryan and Jay and Brennan and myself together on a weekly basis. And if that wasn't exciting enough, we are also going to make the podcast video as well as audio. The audio component will stay the same. If you're a listener to the podcast and you don't want to watch on YouTube, that is fine. The audio podcast will still be available, but we are also moving to the video space. We're moving to YouTube. So if you want to head on over there to our YouTube channel and subscribe, we would greatly appreciate it.
See what we look like. We actually have faces. We're real people.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can find us there at youtube.com/InSessionFilm. And coming with those changes will be a new structural format as well. Because as you know, when Ryan and Jay join us here on the main show, it tends to be quite lengthy. And we don't want every show to be 4.5 hours long.
There's going to be a new name. It's the Rabbit Hole Podcast.
Exactly.
Cinematic Rabbit Hole.
Yeah, but we will be making structural changes. I do not have the bandwidth or the resources to consistently be here for 4.5 hours every week. So, in fact, it's the biggest criticism we've always received here on the show is that it's too long. And we know it's too long. I literally cannot remember the last main show episode. It may have been in the 300s somewhere that was under 2 hours.
That's a sad thought.
Yeah.
That is so sad.
It's been quite a long time. We've had a lot of fun, and we hope that you've enjoyed the show despite its length, but the new structure of the show will help ensure that the episodes are not 2.5 hours. We are going to aim for 90 minutes, give or take some weeks, of course. And we will not be doing reviews on the new main show podcast with the new format. There will be tons of film conversation, top 5 lists, movie drafts, all kinds of fun hijinks with Ryan and Jay joining us, and we do look forward to that. We will still be doing reviews, but those will live as separate episodes. Those will live as their own entities that will be easier to search and much more digestible. They won't be bogged down with other content surrounding it and potentially drowning it out in the process. We are hopeful moving forward. Finding the reviews and listening to the reviews will be a much easier and seamless process while enjoying the new main show podcast, which will have a more diverting effect.
Yeah, and a more interactive effect is kind of another vibe that we're sort of going with that. A bit more of a roundtable kind of feel. We recognize that when the four of us are together, while we do tend to talk a lot, sometimes the best conversations come out when there really isn't a specific review or guideline sort of tying everything together. And that's what we wanted to focus on. And to your point, JD, we do also recognize that the things that we love to do is talk in depth about the movies themselves, which is why selfishly, the reviews in some way still have to stay, but keeping them separate, keeping them their own entities, they'll be searchable. They'll also be easier to find. They'll be their own beast. So those itches are still going to be scratched nonetheless.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it gives us flexibility as far as getting those reviews out there in a more timely fashion versus the way it's more structured from a week-to-week basis. Having the four of us, it gives us flexibility as to who can be available for what reviews. So this new phase, this new structure will be kind to us as four hosts who are trying to make this happen from week to week. But we're also confident that it'll make room for the camaraderie between us four on the main show, as you're talking about there, Brendan, which we have really come to love and to really cherish that time with the four of us. And yeah, the reviews themselves have gotten longer and longer over the years because one of the camaraderie, but also the thoughtfulness, the analytical mindset we approach to the reviews. It just tends to take a little bit longer than what it used to be. Yep. And we want to have them separate so it's easier to find. It's more digestible. I think of the reviews that we've done here on the show, especially that fall into the back half of the show, not just with us, but with Extra Film as well. It's a little bit easier to find the reviews up front because it's usually 5, 7, 8 minutes into the show. But unless you try to find the timestamps that we throw out there for all of the podcast, it can be maybe a little bit challenging to scroll through a 2.5 hour podcast and go, where is this Glass Onion review?
Yeah.
That can be a little cumbersome.
Think of it this way. In some ways, it's almost like separating out those bookmarks in their own episodic format.
Exactly.
In some ways. And honestly, I think that's going to be easier for everyone.
Exactly. So if we're looking at the Babylon Glass Onion episode specifically, if those two reviews simply live as their own podcast that are 45, 50 minutes each, it's much more digestible. They're not bogged down by other content, much easier to find. So we're very confident that format will be much easier for our listening audience and our viewing audience, again, as we move over to the video space as well. So
Exactly.
So we're very excited. That is our big announcement. The show isn't going anywhere. It's just changing and evolving. The show, as you know it to be, this will be the last week of it. And I'm weirdly nostalgic about it, but starting next week, we are moving into the future of InSession Film. And I think it's time. Our 10-year anniversary is next week. And the new show will come out the day that we turn 10 years old. Again,
January
I just find
30th,
it all very
baby.
serendipitous.
It's on the birthday. We got it. We planned that out perfectly.
I think it's going to be very serendipitous and fitting in that regard. Very excited to have more conversations with Ryan and Jay. As much as I've loved Extra Film, I am excited to be with them more on a weekly basis than just texting with them and our text group. So So that'll be really fun, and I'm really looking forward to that. Of course, we're open to any feedback that anyone has out there as well. I was
just going to say, this is a new thing for us as well. So honestly, for all of you listening out there, if you choose to tune in, not just in the podcast format, but also in the video space, and you want to see what we're doing there, first off, we really do appreciate that, but we'd even more appreciate getting some feedback from you, because this could end up being a work in progress of sorts. We have an idea, we have a vision, we're proud of that vision. We hope it works, but this is also your show as well. And I'm talking to all the listeners out there. We want to hear from you if you think this, if there are things you would like to see us try out, because there's a lot to this. Yeah, there'll be some moving parts. It'll be changing and evolving as we go. But at the end of the day, we wanted to separate that thoughtful analysis in the reviews for all the reasons we just mentioned, and to make the main show, to include that camaraderie that the four of us have, which we've tried to offer during the year-end award show. I think you really sense it there and you feel it. Yeah, you sense it for about 9 hours.
For a long time. So we want to take that and condense it down to 90 minutes each week, which comes with the new structure. But we wanted to have that every week. That diverting effect you get from the award show is just something we want to bring, especially when we're going to video. It just feels like the right move to make at this time. And so we're combining shows, moving to video. That is ultimately what we're doing here. But episode 518, that's what we're doing here right now. It is the 2013 retrospective, looking back at a year that we covered in its entirety in our first season 10 years ago. It's pretty wild. So I'm ready to get nostalgic. Yeah. Starting off here with a review of Inside Llewyn Davis and then getting to our top 10 movies of that year as well. So without further ado, let's get into it.
And here we go.
If I had wings like Noah's dove, I'd fly the river to the one I love. Oh, fare thee well, my Johnny, fare thee well. Well, I had a man, strong and tall. He moved his body like a cannonball. Well, fare thee well.
You're listening to the InSession Film Podcast. This is episode 518. Brendan, I'm loving this new podcast setup, but who wrote this?
I did.
I don't want it, don't send me off into outer space. I sweat when they put me
Yeah,
in
but
the
we want to go to
pressure
the. Let's do the
scene.
please into the verse.
Really?
Yeah.
Don't send off into outer. What? No, I can't. Because then it gets all muddled up into the verse.
No. No, you just do the pa-pa-pas into the verse. If you do two pa-pas.
Pa-pa.
Yep.
On the sweat when
Yep.
they... Really?
Yep.
I sweat when they stuff me in the pressure suits. Bubble helmet, flash, gold boots. Nowhere up there. Gravity. That's no place to be a hero. Okay. Okay. Okay, look, I'm happy for the gig, but who wrote this?
I did.
Okay.
So, okay.
Good.
Shout.
Please, Mr. Kennedy, take one, and we're rolling.
All right. Inside Llewyn Davis is directed by Joel and Ethan Cohen. It stars Oscar Isaac, Carey Mulligan, John Goodman, Justin Timberlake, Garrett Hedlund in a small role, as well as many others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with Inside Llewyn Davis, you should be. But just in case, it is a week in the life of a young singer as he navigates the Greenwich Village folk scene in 1961. Brendan, I noted in the intro a couple of times that this is weirdly nostalgic for me.
Oh, yeah.
We're revisiting 2013, a year that we did cover in real time. The first time we talked about Inside Llewyn Davis, it was the last extra film of that year. We coupled it with Spike Jonze's Her, a hell of a double feature, leading into the award show
We're
that
talking
year.
about exactly why 2013
Yeah.
is looked upon as perhaps the best
Yes.
cinematic year of the last decade.
Absolutely. But at the time in 2013, I wasn't as high on the film as I am now. And I'll certainly get into that here.
Oh,
in a
it
minute.
does sneak up on you. I'm
Yes.
with you on that.
Absolutely. So this review will be a lot different than it was the first time around. And I'm very, very eager to get into it. So, Brennan, I want to hear from you first. What do you think about Inside Llewyn Davis?
Yeah, this movie sucks, man. What are you setting me up for? I'm just being set up for failure. This movie rocks. This movie absolutely rocks.
Yeah.
And I'm a local musician, as you know. I mean, we're
Yeah.
on StreamYard now. You could see me. I could see you. You could see the bass guitar in my back corner as well. So
Yeah.
I am a local musician here in the Philadelphia area. And I think what's interesting is, I'm not a folk music aficionado. In fact, I probably have more in common artistically with John Goodman's character, Roland Turner, the jazz musician,
Yeah.
than I do Llewyn Davis himself.
Sure.
But I will say there is something that this movie, Inside Llewyn Davis, gets right about the local music scene in general, regardless of where that local music scene is. Being a local musician sometimes really sucks. And this movie does tap into that without really tapping into that.
Yeah.
And we'll certainly talk about that further, that this is not just a movie about music. It's way more intricate than just that. In many ways, that's really just the setting.
Yeah.
I do think this is one of the Coen brothers' best films. If it's not their very best, it's at the very least their saddest film. At least I think that argument could be made.
Yeah.
I think it is perhaps their most melancholic. And, we've talked about this before, JD, with this film being one of the great modern explorations of grief. That's really what this movie is. But I don't know how often we acknowledge the interesting angle that this film takes on, because more often than not, movies about grief deal with the loss of, let's say, a loved one, like a significant other most specifically, or maybe a family member or a child. Looking at a child, a movie like First Man, Damien Chazelle's First Man is another great example of that.
Yep.
But how often does one come around that actually explores the loss of a best friend?
Yeah.
I can't really name that many offhand. I'm sure there are, and there are certainly some movies that we can compare this to in that specific regard. But I can't think of that many offhand when compared to other movies about grief. This really is about the loss of a partner and best friend, that best friend in question being Llewyn's music partner named Mikey, I think.
Yeah.
And this is someone we never even meet throughout the film, which turns this into a bit of a ghost story of sorts when you really think about it. Mikey's presence is constantly haunting the screen, and I think that really is why Bruno Delbonnel's cinematography is so good. There's this white, grayish hue to it that almost has a ghostly aura, and I don't know if that was intentional. That was probably just the winter vibe that they were trying to convey, the sense of coldness and despondency. But I think it weirdly adds a haunted nature to this movie that just makes it perhaps the Coen brothers' most melancholic film. So it is one... I'm with you. I really liked it when I first saw it, but as time has gone on, I think this is, at worst, top 5 Coen brother movies. I think in that kind of echelon, it certainly fits in the conversation. I think it's a great film. It's a sad film. I can't always sit back and watch it for enjoyment, but I'm always thinking about it for sure.
Yeah, this is a film that we've talked about many a times here over the years via top 3 lists that we've done. How many times was this brought up in a top 3 list? It's almost hard to count. When we did our top 10 movies of all time, not that long ago on episode 500, this sat at number 20 for me.
Yeah,
that's how high I am on this film.
That's really high, yeah.
I think this is one of the best films ever made. It is my favorite film of 2013. Spoiler alert for later. It's my number 2 film of the decade that we did on episode 363. And it is my favorite Coen brothers film. I don't know how polarizing that is, but I do think this is their best film. It certainly is their most melancholic. I agree, but I would also argue this is their best work. There is not a false note here in this film. The music is astounding, and not just because it's a phenomenal folk soundtrack, but the contrast between Oscar Isaac and Marcus Mumford, who is the voice of Llewyn's former partner, Mikey, as Brendan is talking about there. And together, they are fantastic on the soundtrack. But with Llewyn throughout the film, while he is very good, there is something missing still. It's just not quite as clean as what you hear on the record with him and Mikey together. And I don't think that was an accident.
I agree.
do want to talk more about that as this conversation goes. But the music on the whole is exquisite. Oscar Isaac gives one of the best performances of the 2010s. He should have won Best Actor at the Oscars. That was something else I talked about on episode 363, as he was a nominee for me for Best Actor. His reaction shots here are nothing short of sublime. Sometimes it's bitingly hilarious. Other times it's very poignant and sorrowful. And that duality is striking as Llewyn wrestles with his identity throughout the film. And that's perhaps what I find most engrossing here, because it's not just this examination of a struggling artist or a young man trying to come to terms with how unlucky he is and that he isn't going to make it. And Llewyn is very unlucky in many respects, but Llewyn's identity crisis isn't rooted in that. As you talked about, Brennan, it is wholly born out of grief. We find out early on that Mikey had recently committed suicide, and what we see in Llewyn, every choice he makes is a result of undealt with grief. And as a result, his identity is constantly wavering as he attempts to be a solo act, which he struggles with, not because he isn't talented, he very clearly is, but at every turn, he's constantly reminded of how he and Mikey were great together. I mean, how many times is Mikey brought up to him unprompted? It happens often. Or there's references to other groups and trios, and hey, look at how great they are together, as to suggest that being in a group or a duo is better. And so he becomes stuck in this cyclical rut that isn't any fault of his own doing, and it is heartbreaking to watch. Llewyn is a bit abrasive at times, but...
Yeah, I have thoughts about that.
for sure. But when you consider what's driving his bitterness and how he arrived there, there's plenty of empathy to be had. And boy, do I love it. Then there's the Coen's direction, the cinematography, which is evocative. The period aesthetics are great. A sensational film all around.
Well, I think this is why this is one of those movies that absolutely gets better with time, because there's so much about it dramatically that reshapes with time, that's recontextualized with time. Because the first time you watch it, and we sort of admitted this, we both really liked it when we first saw it, but it took repeat viewings to really find that empathy that was always there. Yeah. I feel like that sadness was always there, but with the Coen brothers, they're very tricky. They're very sneaky with what they're actually trying to tell you and convey, whether it be something as sad as this, or even in some of their comedies. A movie like Fargo, for instance, I never thought was a comedy until I saw it like 4 times, and now I think that movie's hilarious.
Sure.
It's like each one of their movies slowly reveal themselves further. And in the case of Inside Llewyn Davis, the first time you watch it, it's kind of a fair assessment to say, I can't root for this guy. He's just an asshole. Yeah. And I think that is absolutely fair. But the more you watch it and you sort of discover what he's holding back and you sense what Oscar Isaac is doing, you start to see everyone else as assholes too, and that he is actually more of a victim in this situation.
Sure.
And you actually feel a lot of pity for him. And I think that's why his performance is really good. It's kind of astounding that he didn't get more Oscar love specifically for it. This movie was only nominated for 2 Oscars.
It's wild. Absolutely insane to me.
Now, 2 earned nominations for sure. I mean, Best Cinematography and Best Sound Mixing, I think. But maybe it just has to do with the year it was competing with. Movies like 12 Years a Slave and Gravity and some others that I'm sure we'll talk about during the back half of this show. I feel like this is a movie that would have done better if it came out in a different year. The movie holds a 93% on Metacritic, and it's one that, as you said, there are a lot of critics out there who have learned to really love it more with time. I've heard a lot of people say this is at least top 3 Coen brothers. I'm with you. I'm with you in that regard too, and I think more people are appreciating this one with time because it is the Coen brothers at their most subtle and sneaky. I guess their trademarks are there, but they're just harder to recognize initially. But that's something I love about it. It's not a puzzle box movie, but it almost feels like one.
No, it's absolutely a movie that garners repeat viewings, and it is often very funny. I certainly do want to talk about some of the film's humor. Yeah. But to echo what you're saying there about the coarseness of Llewyn, and I did somewhat mention this in my opening thoughts as well, there is a duality to Llewyn. And one of my favorite scenes of the film that reverberates this is the dinner scene that takes place somewhat early on at the Gorfians' apartment. And during this scene, there comes a moment where the Gorfians ask Llewyn to play a song as they settle in for the night. And it's honestly one of the most insightful moments of the film because it tells us a lot about Llewyn and his emotional state, again, as someone who's struggling to grieve over Mikey, and also his own ego. I love his reaction shot when they first ask him to sing, as he refutes them by saying, "Look, I'm not a trained poodle." Okay. Yeah. It's really hilarious, but it does demonstrate how Llewyn sees himself above a guy who sings at small social gatherings. He sees himself as a true artist who only performs when the situation is professional. At one point in the scene, he says, "It's not a parlor game. It's something that I do for a living." To his credit, though, he does start to play Fare Thee Well, one of my favorite songs on the soundtrack. It's one we hear earlier in the film. Yeah. But it doesn't take long for the wheels to fall off as Mrs. Gorfien starts harmonizing with Llewyn and performing the harmony that would have been done by Mikey. Yeah. And Llewyn loses his mind. He gets really angry and verbally antagonistic toward the Gorfians. And as off-putting as Llewyn is in the moment, more than anything, I think it poignantly denotes his grief and heartache. The visual of him lowering his head when Mrs. Gorfien starts harmonizing is genuinely heartbreaking. You sense that in the performance there by Oscar Isaac. And that's noteworthy because we know that it has nothing to do with Mrs. Gorfine, which is indicative of his apology to her later on in the film. But rather, it's clear that he just wants it to be Mikey. He hears that harmony and he just wants it to be Mikey. And his grief gets the best of him in the moment, which is why his outburst is cathartic. Even if it's boorish, again, there's empathy to be had. And how Oscar Isaac tiptoes that line of heartache and antagonism, pitch perfect. Well, and absolutely glorious.
And think about how someone like Llewyn Davis would feel in that moment. I mean, it's not just the grief, as you're saying, even though that is a significant part of it, perhaps the most important part of it, but the way that people around him keep constantly reminding him of his partnership with Mikey, often literally so. Mm-hmm. And then you have Llewyn Davis, who is now essentially forced to become a solo act, and he wants to be successful as a solo act. If people keep literally reminding him about his partnership with Mikey, it almost comes off as if people are suggesting Mikey was the most important part of your duo. You can't do this on your own. And of course, he's grieving the loss of his friend, but that perhaps makes him feel even less significant then. That hurts. That absolutely hurts as someone who is trying to artistically make a living. I mean, it's not just a hobby for him, as he says. There is some truth in that. So while he does see himself as maybe a bit above, as you say, in a way, it's because he needs to keep telling himself that because he's desperate and needs to make it on his own. But he can't do that with people keep reminding him about Mikey, and perhaps it makes him feel a little bit inferior. So the first time I saw the movie in a dinner scene like that, I think, oh man, this guy's rubbing me the wrong way. But the second time around, I just want to give him a hug. I do. That's what I love about it.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about the cyclical nature of the film, but yes, there is this repeating motif that he's constantly reminded of Mikey, and oftentimes very unprompted, such as what we see in that dinner scene with the Gorfines. There's the Bud Grossman moment, which we'll certainly get to, don't worry, or the scene with Gene in the park. There's a moment early on with his current music agent, who, of course, brings up Mikey. His sister brings him up at one point. Constantly, he is being reminded of Mikey. There's another moment, and this also speaks to what you were just saying there, Brennan, about how upon rewatches, you just gain more insight into Llewyn and this film and what it's doing with its grief. I actually had that experience when rewatching it again, and I've seen this movie, I don't know, dozens of times by this point.
I was going to say, you had to have seen it at least 10 times by this point or something.
I've seen it quite a bit, and yet on this rewatch, there's a moment that emphasized itself all the more to me than it ever did previously, and it's during the sequence when they are driving to Chicago. And he's in this car. There's the Roland character, played by John Goodman, and he asks Llewyn about his music partner. Llewyn tells him that he jumped off the George Washington Bridge, to which Roland remarks, "The George Washington Bridge? What is he, a dumbbell?" It's a brief but very potent response back when Llewyn says, "Not really." His reaction shot when he utters those two words is absolutely incredible because it's born out of not just grief and anger, but of love. He's very much implying that Mike was anything but dumb, that he was smart, that he was a great musician. And as we know, Llewyn is still hurting over that loss. Those two words, "not really." It's so brief, you can miss it. I did. I missed it 12 times leading up to this rewatch. And yet, when he says it, it gives so much more weight to this journey that we are seeing with Llewyn, and it just gives credence to the empathy that can be had with him when you dig underneath that on the surface boorishness.
Yeah, and I sense that too. Now, of course, that specific sequence you're talking about is interrupted by one of the funniest insults in all of Coen Brothers history about Roland Turner's cane going so far up his ass.
Immediately following. Again, the duality of Llewyn.
But again, the Coen Brothers and Oscar Isaac's performance, they treat it in a way that's a little sneakier than normal. It's not as abrasive as, let's say, I don't know, a comedy like Burn After Reading or The Lady Killers, for instance. It's not in that same comedic Coen league. But here, there is some of that biting humor. You don't have John Goodman here to keep it straight-faced. You have to get some laughs out of him. That's why he's here. And I love his performance, too, because he's channeling the... I've been using this word a lot, so you might have to start bleeping me out, JD, but he's channeling the assholery that actually exists with jazz musicians, especially at that time in 1961.
A little pretentious,
Well, yeah, there's a snobbery to that genre, and that was certainly the case in the 1960s, 1950s, even into the 1970s when jazz fusion and jazz funk started becoming more of a thing. But that back and forth between them, in any other movie with any other directors who are less talented than the Coens, that could have fallen flat on its face. It could have felt like it came out of a completely different movie, tonally speaking. But the way Isaac performs it, the look in his eyes that suggests absolute grief and loneliness and sadness really sells it. And I love that exchange very much.
Absolutely. And to speak further about the duality of that moment, because I do love that exchange he has with Roland. But right before he has that moment of verbal sparring there, he plays Green, Green, Rocky Road. Hilarious little bit there. Like, I love that. The way Oscar Isaac sings it then leads to that moment of emotion that comes about. And even the rebuttal to Roland about the cane, while very funny, also comes off with a tinge of pathos as well. Like, again, Oscar Isaac somehow rides that line impeccably. And then, of course, that leads to the audition scene in Chicago. But before we get to that, I actually want to first speak to the cyclical nature of the film, because I think that context helps offer up a little bit more nuance to the audition scene. And I do love the attention to detail here regarding the cyclical nature of the film. Narratively speaking, Llewyn, as we've been talking about, he's this guy struggling to cope with how things have shifted for him. He's stuck in this never-ending cycle of misfortune. Some of it his own doing, some of it not. Either way, he's very clearly trapped and isn't sure how to pursue anything but music. And that, of course, becomes this volatile process for him. And I love how the Coens structure the film around that idea. There's a symmetry to the script that I find captivating and how it complements Llewyn's journey. It starts with the opening scene of the film, which is actually the final scene of the film, but recontextualized slightly. And by the end, we come to see he's come full circle, landing in the exact same place he started. There's also the repeating motif of the cat, which we can perhaps talk about as we go here as well, and perhaps what that symbolizes for Llewyn. There's the abortion subplot with Jean, and as we come to learn, this isn't his first rodeo with that either. So once again, there's a recurring theme in Llewyn's life that complicates things all the more, especially when you consider the first abortion and how that is recontextualized for Llewyn later on in the film. And there's, of course, the music. As I noted in my opening thoughts, Fare Thee Well reverberates a couple of times throughout, both in the context of how it sounds on Llewyn and Mikey's original record and with Llewyn as a soloist. And there's a vivid contrast between the two. Hang Me, Oh Hang Me similarly plays a few times with its meaning evolving as the film unfolds. Or you simply think about the trajectory of Llewyn's career and how it not only embodies the cyclical nature of the adversity Llewyn faces, but how it begins and ends with those two songs, Hang Me and Fare Thee Well. From a writing and craft perspective, the Coens are constantly aware of the symmetry of Llewyn, and it becomes a fascinating nucleus that drives everything we see. It seems as if you get to that Chicago scene, you fold the film in half, and there's equal weight on both.
It basically makes a U. It makes a U. Or a teeter-totter, whatever you want to use as a symbolic analogy to describe the narrative thrust of the movie. And I love the way that the Coens go about it in a very tricky way. I'm using that word a lot too. They're very sneaky with the way that they convey things in this movie, whether it be thematically, tonally, narratively, in this case as we're talking about here, because the way the movie opens, it opens with the ending, but the opening kind of suggests this, like, kind of sinister and really serious and important confrontation. But by the end, you kind of realize, It's just a guy that was pissed off at him one day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It doesn't mean nothing, but it kind of means nothing. If that makes sense.
I love that. Yeah.
Which I love. You know, it's literally one of those movies that does end at the beginning, and our character really doesn't grow all that, or they go through that circular arc that I love.
Yes, it
there
is.
Are moments.
There
are moments of growth and change and a metamorphosis of sorts, only for it to regress. It's both a progression and a regression, which are my favorite arcs to see in all movies.
Yeah, I would argue that there is a step forward for Llewyn. I'll get to that here shortly. But
I'd say more of a recognition.
Yes.
Like there's a self-awareness that he certainly learns by the end.
Well, and I think that step forward might be more spiritually, more emotionally, because physically, he literally ends where he begins. And narratively, that's a little bit of a sleight of hand because the opening scene is the ending scene. But in terms of progression of his career, nothing's really changed. So he still ends where he begins. I do think there is a step forward, though. I'll get to that later.
Yeah.
With the cyclical nature context laid to bear, let's talk about the audition scene, shall we?
Oh, F. Murray Abraham saying the words no musician wants to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, this tethers to Llewyn's ethos as an artist, what he thinks of the craft, despite his affliction. He still very much believes in his art and in his craft. And he is really great as a musician. The film demonstrates that very well. And
he's credible.
As a way of trying to continue his career and move past this rut that he's in, he finds his way to Chicago, as we noted, where he goes to audition for Bud Grossman, an owner of a music club there. And after meeting Bud, the two of them sit down alone in this open space, and he begins playing The Death of Mary Jane. And Oscar Isaac sings this song with such cogent pathos that is so remarkably palpable. It is so good, the passion he pours into this moment, which is what makes the composition and framing of the scene so evocative.
A lot of long takes, so there's a genuine sense of performance there too.
Absolutely. You sense the performance. It's just the two of them in this rather intimate setting where the music and craft can be at its most pure. If it was simply about the art, there is no denying Llewyn in this moment. But at the end of it, as Llewyn looks up to Bud, almost looking directly into the camera, as Brendan alluded to, Bud disappointedly notes that it is not marketable. I can't sell that, he says.
There's no money here.
There's
oh my
no
gosh.
money here. And then suggest, as if that sting wasn't good enough, Bud then suggests that he gets back together with his music partner, with Mikey, not knowing the context of what happened to him. And it is devastating.
I will say
there
is a sense of growth in that moment for Llewyn as well, because I feel like in any other moment for any other character, that character may have felt the urge to explain himself, to say, no, I need to do it this way because my partner is literally dead.
Yeah.
Almost to try and prove a point, but he doesn't do that. He doesn't ask for pity or anything like that, which maybe that could be a bit of a growth in his character arc, or could suggest that he still has this chip on his shoulder that he's trying to carry, that this is still his moment. But I love that he doesn't take the opportunity to explain himself, if that makes sense. And maybe that's just the grief taking hold. He literally can't go through that again.
Yeah.
And that's Oscar Isaac's performance, once again, suggesting at least 17 different things at once, which is what I love. You can infer all of these things, and whether it was Oscar Isaac's intent or Joel and Ethan Coen's intent, I don't think it matters. I mean, they're making it blank enough that they're forcing the intent on us anyway.
And I think it's important to note that while there are a couple of moments earlier in the film that highlight Llewyn's potential ego, I mentioned the Gorfine dinner scene where they ask him to play, and his response there is, I'm not a trained poodle. I do this for a living. I'm not doing this at a small social gathering. There's also the moment at the Gaslight earlier where the Troy character goes to invite Jim and Gene on stage, and Llewyn,
I don't have my guitar.
I don't have my guitar. He assumes that Troy's going to call him on stage.
Yeah.
And his ego gets the best of him there. Even though he's struggling as a solo artist, he still thinks that people look at him as the guy, so to speak. So there are a couple of times where his ego gets the best of him. When Bud suggests that he become a part of this trio, or he gets back together with his music partner, his refusal, though, Llewyn's refusal there, I do not think is born out of ego. It is him trying to distance himself from that grief. He doesn't want to be a part of a trio because there's no way it'll live up to the level of experience he had with Mikey. I don't think he believes that he'll ever be as good with anyone else as he was with Mikey. It is not ego. It has nothing to do with whoever the other two musicians are. It is, I cannot be a part of another duo or another group because I'm still grieving. I'm still not over the loss of my friend. It is 100% that.
Yeah.
And to your point, instead of explaining that, he just simply says, that's great advice. And again, Oscar Isaac, the way he delivers that line, it is devastating.
And to get a little personal for a little bit, if I look at this scene in a vacuum and look at it more from an artistic angle, from a musical angle, as opposed to how it functions within the movie and how grief is playing a part in it. For a little context, I play bass guitar in a rock band, and the bassist is meant to be someone that's maybe not necessarily in the background, but meant to blend in with a unit. You know, it's not I'm not the star of the show when I play on stage with my band, and I recognize that. At times, I had to learn that a little bit. You know, there are times I'd be like, I want to stand out. I want to feature in this song, but that's not my job. That's not my job. And sometimes, as a musician, you have to recognize what your maybe not necessarily what your skills are, but what your role is, because sometimes you have a specific role that you need to contribute for, and maybe in this moment, if you look at it from an artistic angle, Llewyn Davis is absolutely great. He's so good. He's a great vocalist, great songwriter. If we're assuming that these are some of his songs here too, and a great guitar player for the music that he is doing. But in this current landscape in 1961, his talents are maybe best suited to work with a unit like it was with Mikey. And maybe as an artist, he needed to recognize that too. But
at this moment, he cannot be a part of another group.
Exactly. That's the irony.
And that
of
is the irony. Yeah, because maybe in another year, if Bud was to have the same offer, maybe he accepts it. Maybe once he's done with the grieving process, he can relent and take on that role that you're talking about. But in this moment, he can't because he's still grieving. He's not over Mike, and he knows that getting together with someone else is not going to remedy that grief. I think the scene also crystallizes this other duality in Llewyn as it relates to his experiences regarding his craft versus the business. He's clearly agitated by the business part of it. He finds much of it phony and off-putting. For him, it's all about the music. It's about the art, but the business, for whatever reason, doesn't gravitate toward that. And when you couple that with the emotional turmoil that he's experienced, it creates a concoction that is heartbreaking given how it compounds on his misfortunes, keeping him stuck in this cycle that he finds himself in, and how that tethers to the ending of the film, especially under the guise of the film's cyclical nature, I think is pretty ravishing. Yeah, I agree with that as well. And the music is certainly a key weapon, if you will, in contributing to that cyclical nature. I mean, the way that the songs are placed, where they're performed, when they're chosen to be performed in the context of this narrative, it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. That is crucial to this film. The music, when it is injected, how Oscar Isaac plays it, gives so much credence to Llewyn's ethos regarding art and craft. And again, how that juxtaposes the business end of it. And it starts early on in that opening scene where he sings Hang Me, Oh Hang Me. Absolutely incredible way to open this film. Obviously, because it's the opening of the film, we haven't learned yet about his grief and how deeply wounded he is. But there is a soulful nature to this moment, and the way Llewyn is singing this song, the way it's staged and framed, it suggests that maybe something is lingering there with Llewyn, or that something is about to unfold that is melancholic, which makes this song so ironic as it lyrically talks about him hanging and being dead and gone.
Yeah.
But given how much he's struggling, emotionally speaking, it makes the song all the more poignant. And it's interesting how cathartic it becomes while doing the only thing that feels true for him. The way Oscar Isaac sings it taps further into the dualities in Llewyn that we eventually come to see in the character. It's sorrowful. There's a despondency to it, but the raw intimacy of it makes him so alluring and intriguing. Maybe he is better with Mikey, but there's no denying the mournful delicacy of this opening sequence as he sings.
He's talented.
Amy. Absolutely. And again, that duality, I cannot echo enough. Oscar Isaac is so impressive with how he rides that line. In fact, I've noted this on the show several times throughout our history. I loved Oscar Isaac as a singer in this film so much and as a stage performer that I equally and selfishly want him to pursue a real career in music as well as acting.
I would love to hear that too. It's actually pretty interesting watching his mannerisms and his vocal stylings. He's not playing a real person, but he was somewhat inspired by a real folk musician named what was his name? It was Dave Van Ronk. Yeah, Dave Van Ronk. And while he's not really playing that person, I know a lot of biographers have said that Llewyn Davis is not Dave, but the music is. And he's certainly channeling something there. It's actually pretty interesting. There's an album from 1964 called
Inside
Dave Van Ronk.
Yeah.
And if you look at that album cover, not only does it look kind of like Oscar Isaac,
it's pretty much verbatim.
There's a freaking cat on the album cover.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
And that song, Hang Me, Oh Hang Me, is on Dave Van Ronk's album, Inside Dave Van Ronk. So that is something that they are.
Yeah, I think you might be right. I have to look into that.
And I think that's partially why they open the film with this song. Again, recontextualizing it by the end, because even though the film opens with him singing the song, it's actually the ending sequence of the film, which is why you feel that raw intimacy to it. As I noted, when the film opens, we don't know about Llewyn's grief. We don't know how deeply wounded he is, but as the song progresses, it becomes incredibly ironic, and you really do feel Oscar Isaac giving it everything he has. It's completely transfixing. I love the way it's shot as well. You mentioned the cinematography earlier. The gray, hazy aesthetic of this film complements everything we see so beautifully. And the close-up on Isaac and the look on his face says everything we need to know about him as a character. It completely sets the stage for what we're about to see. And then you get to the ending of the film where he once again finishes that song, Hang Me, Oh Hang Me, and he begins to play Fare Thee Well.
Yep.
And similarly to Hang Me, it's a song of melancholy, and it's really great. And again, I love the variation of Oscar Isaac, as Llewyn, of course, singing it live, because it needs to be different from the soundtrack version of the song, which still has an arresting quality to it, but it is more upbeat with its melody. But in this moment, Llewyn chooses to render the song in a much more raw and intimate way that echoes everything we've seen with him previously. He's given this career all he's had. He drove all the way to Chicago to give it one more crack, as we talked about. He left it all on the field, so to speak. And yet, he's still stuck in his adversity. So this time, Fare Thee Well is almost literal. He sings it as if he's singing it to Mike, as if he's singing it to himself. I've had a good run, but now it is time to bid fare thee well. And maybe it's true that he's better with Mike.
Yeah.
Llewyn acknowledges that several times throughout the film, as we've talked about. So perhaps this rendition isn't quite as clean or sharp, but the catharsis of it makes it so beautiful and elegant, especially when coupled with the Coen's direction and cinematography. It's a great moment, but it can't end there, can it?
Well, it can't. And this is what I love so much about what you're saying is that in some ways it's also the final line of the movie.
Yeah.
In many ways, the final line it's not literally fare thee well, but it is a paraphrase.
It is that essentially, yeah.
Yeah, and now it means something maybe a little bit different. It has more of a snarky jokiness to it, as if Llewyn Davis still has this sort of ego that he just has to get the last word in his own way. So again, here are the Coens and Oscar Isaac just sort of like playing on both ends of that spectrum.
Yeah.
He's saying beautifully, fare thee well, only to say, yeah, fare thee well, screw you. It's amazing.
I love it. I love it because we've talked about the duality of this film. It's all about duality. I love that Llewyn comes off the stage after this beautiful rendition of these two songs for all the reasons we just talked about. And outside the bar is someone there waiting for him because of a not so beautiful exchange the night before.
Yep.
And it leads to this altercation. I think we should just spoil it. Most people by now have probably seen this movie. If you haven't, you've made it this far into the review, I don't know what to tell you, but the film ends with him saying au revoir.
Yeah.
Impeccable line that tethers into Fare Thee Well, as you were just talking about. Oh,
is that the best final line from a Coen Brothers film?
It's got to be. It's got to be.
Yeah.
It's certainly up there.
At the very least, the best delivered final line from a Coen Brothers film. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the final monologue from No Country for Old Men is great for all of its own reasons, but I don't know. I love the briefness, the snarkiness, the irony of this one too. It's something. It's something.
All right. Perhaps we could get to final thoughts, or would you want to talk about the cat first?
What up with the cat? Yeah, what up with the cat?
Shit, let's talk about the cat first, and then we'll get to final thoughts.
Yeah, I think we need to. I don't really know what the cat means, honestly. I've seen a lot of people theorize that the cat is meant to represent Llewyn himself. Okay. And I can kind of see that. I mean, the fact that there are two identical cats in this movie, each on their own respective lost journey of sorts, maybe that could be a mirroring of Mikey and Llewyn in their own respective plights. But other than that, I don't really know. Like, what do you think, JD? What up with the cat?
I don't think it symbolizes Llewyn, although there's certainly an argument to be made that it is emblematic of his identity crisis.
Yeah.
Llewyn plays Fare Thee Well from the record that he did with Mike when the cat escapes. So he puts the record on, the cat escapes, and from there he starts carrying it around as if he's holding on to the past. The cat.
It's a literal burden.
It is a literal burden. It continuously tries to run away, first in the subway, then later down the fire escape. And each time Llewyn is desperate to find it, to hold on to it, partially because it's not his cat. So there's a level of responsibility at play, but maybe there's more to it for Llewyn. Even after finding the stray and mistaking it for the Gorfine's cat, he still doesn't let go. He holds on to the cat like he can't let go of the past. Like he can't let go of Mikey. That is until he gets close to Chicago. And if he's going to make it as a solo artist, he has to move on. So he leaves the cat behind, but not before the camera lingers on the cat for a good long beat. I love that.
If you're an animal lover, maybe don't watch that specific shot.
Well, that shot, I do see what you're saying.
There's a sense of I mean, but even that shot, the innocence of that cat and the sense of abandonment that, I mean, if we are to look at cats as smart as they are, this cat is probably recognizing in the moment, you're leaving me, aren't you?
Yeah, from a literal perspective, it is a little heartbreaking, I guess, that abandonment. But symbolically speaking, I do think it is necessary because he goes on to the audition, which ironically doesn't go very well, and it ends with Grossman telling Llewyn to get back with his music partner, as we noted earlier. So what happens on the way home, he hits the cat with his car, which was probably just a dream, or at least you could argue so, or maybe it's just a symbolic way of Llewyn separating himself from Mikey.
Yeah.
But either way, he has to move forward, even if everyone else around him forever wants to tether him to Mikey. And that certainly seems to be the case. And that's why I said earlier, I do think there is a level of progression with Llewyn, at least spiritually, at least emotionally. And I think it tethers to this cat that he can't let go of. He has to hold on to the past, as if this cat is emblematic of perhaps Mikey himself. And then he lets go of the cat. He leaves the cat behind. I cannot do this audition with Mikey. I have to do it on my own. He does, and gloriously fails in the process.
Yeah.
But to move forward still, he has to break that chain. He has to break away from the cat, and does so in an interesting way, because it also tethers back to the motif of the abortion. He's looking at a sign. He's looking at a city in the distance because there's perhaps a child of his that he didn't know about earlier.
A 2-year-old, I think, at this point.
Yeah. He's thinking about being a father, and should I go visit this child? That I find so fascinating. We haven't even dug into that too much, but thinking about the symbolic nature of that, what he's thinking about in that regard, the future of what if. And again, to pursue that, you have to break away from the chains that's holding you down, that is Mikey. And that's when those two things collide. I just find that fascinating. So if anything, I think the cat is more emblematic of Mikey more than anything else.
Yeah.
And I think it's effective here because it's often very funny when the cat is at play, and then it ends in this poignant way, again, speaking to the duality of Llewyn.
Yeah, it's like the choice to make this character a cat is also an interesting one. I'm not really sure the reasoning for that. I mean, maybe just the Coen brothers love cats. I don't know. I think also finding out that the Gorfine's cat is named Ulysses has some hidden meanings there too. What does the name Ulysses even mean? I think it means like spiteful or wrathful or something, which maybe Llewyn takes to heart. I mean, there's also, I guess, how the name is also, I guess, inspired by, and I'm looking this up as we're talking here. I guess it's a Greek name inspired by the word Odyssey or epic adventure, which is more or less what Llewyn Davis just went on. Yeah. So, because I always wondered when he finds out the cat's name is Ulysses, he's like, that's his name? That's his name? As if it was some sort of epiphany. And I never really knew why. So maybe we're not supposed to know why, but maybe it is just speculative. But maybe it is because a name like Ulysses does have those hidden meanings like that could make their way into Llewyn's own mindset, if that makes sense.
Well, and maybe that does speak to this spiritual progression because, as we noted in the final scene of this film, his career hasn't gone in any sort of direction. It ends where it begins. But did he go on an epic adventure of sorts, emotionally speaking? I think there's an argument to be made there for sure. And so perhaps that's what the name is alluding to. I think there's credence to that idea. And on a side note, I briefly mentioned this earlier, but right before he finds out that the cat is there and he finds out its name, that moment with Mrs. Gorfine is so great. I think it is actually kind of important because his apology there, it is so sincere and so genuine, and it gives credence to the notion that when he lashed out at her, it had nothing to do with her. They are good friends. They are close. They do care about Llewyn. In that moment, when he hears the harmonizing, he just wanted it to be Mikey, but it can't be. And I think his grief gets the best of him. So that apology, as brief as it is, I think is actually kind of important, and it's really endearing.
Well, it feels like it comes from a genuine place, and that goes back to that sense of growth that you do still sense in the character, even if it is maybe subtle and a bit circular, as we're saying.
Yeah. So all of that to say that the cat is actually Marcus Mumford. That's where we're going now.
Or T-Bone Burnett.
Yeah.
Maybe the two of them working together. God, the music here is so good.
so
the production
good.
for the
It's so
music is
good.
great.
Yeah, this soundtrack is absolutely phenomenal. All right, let's get to final thoughts. Brennan, do you have any concluding thoughts here on Inside Llewyn Davis?
Well, I'm curious, who's your favorite performance in the movie outside of Oscar Isaac? Because we haven't really talked much about
how did we not
this.
get to that?
I
Yeah,
know. I mean, we
have
talked
to
about a
talk
few of
it.
them. We obviously talked about John Goodman. We talked about, we mentioned Justin Timberlake and Carey Mulligan, but we didn't really talk about them. And of course, there's Adam Driver singing about outer space, which will never not get old. Actually, I think he has the funniest line in the movie, and it's nothing to do with that song. It's when Llewyn asks if he can, stay at his place, and says, "Oh, nice place," and he goes, "It's a dump."
It's so good. Yeah. Just so blunt.
That's the dry Coen Brothers magic really working overtime there.
Yeah. We do need to talk about Please, Mr. Kennedy. There's so much to Llewyn, and we wanted to dive into what makes him so great as a character. And even in that, there's still more to talk about, like the moments he has with his sister, with his father even. There's a really touching moment he has with his father near the end of the film. So it's still...
Even though you find out his father was just wetting himself the whole time.
Yeah. While he's playing, again, another good song. Again, showcasing his talents there. But then there's these other characters on the periphery, such as Gene and Jim. And then there's Al Cody. Please, Mr. Kennedy, that sequence, it is top 3 moments in the Coen Brothers filmography regarding humor. It is so funny. It is maybe their funniest scene.
I know we're seeing Joel and Ethan branch off into their own, directorial efforts now. I mean, Joel Coen just did it with The Tragedy of Macbeth, but looking back at their filmography when they're working together, 2 of my favorite moments of their entire career are music-based. Not just Please, Mr. Kennedy from this one, or really any music scene in this movie when you think about it, but also both versions or both performances of Man of Constant Sorrow from Oh
good.
Brother, Where Art Thou?
Absolutely. Yes, that comes to mind.
Or of course, the musical number with Channing Tatum from Hail Caesar.
Incredible, yes.
Why don't they just do a straight musical is basically what I'm getting at.
They should. Well, you know what? I did think about that with Inside Llewyn Davis. I think this could be classified as a musical.
I could see it getting a stage adaptation, maybe being morphed into that, kind of similar to how John Carney's Once was, then transitioned to Broadway, but that's obviously a very different vibe, more literal in the way that it functions as a musical of a sort, but this can still work in that way, I think.
I think so. I mean, as we talked about, it opens with Hang Me, Oh Hang Me. Then soon after, we get to the scene where he puts on the record of If We Had Wings is the name of the album that he did with Mikey. And that is actually a really great moment. There's a great shot of Llewyn as he looks at the album cover, reminiscing.
Yeah.
And it's there you really start to see the grief subtly speaking. I love the reaction shot there of Llewyn as he looks at the cover.
Perfect editing, because it actually shows Mikey's name to actually use visual storytelling to tell us what he's grieving about without telling us what he's grieving about. So I love that.
And I love the subtle pathos of the title of the album, If We Had Wings, which then Llewyn has to sing as a solo artist, If I Had Wings.
Yeah.
So that subtle change from we to I is a little heartbreaking on its own. But he puts on the record. He plays Fare Thee Well. It plays in its entirety. That whole sequence is really great. Then there comes a couple of more musical numbers. There's the one with Troy, as I mentioned earlier. Jim and Gene have a song, 500 Miles. Is that the name of it?
I think
can't
so.
recall.
Something like that, yeah.
But there's 2 songs back to back. There's another trio that I don't think we ever hear their names. They play a song. Then there's the Please, Mr. Kennedy moment. Then we get to Chicago with the audition where he sings the death of Queen Mary Jane. And then we get the 2 songs not long after they're at the Gaslight, where he again revisiting the cyclical nature of the film.
Even the night before, they're the 2 that he sort of makes fun of.
Yes, exactly. Yes, there's
the
those
Irish,
as well.
The Irish quad They weren't a trio. They were a quad, I think. And then there was the woman that came up and he mocked the whole time. So there are more musical components there too.
And it ends with a musical moment of Llewyn walking out the bar and seeing a young Bob Dylan go on stage to sing a song. So the film doesn't go that long in between musical sequences. Music is all over this film. So it's not a traditional music. It's not a La La Land or a Chicago, but it still acts as a musical. Music is all over this movie.
There are more musical performances in this movie than there are in La La Land.
I think you can make that argument, sure, yeah. Then probably in a lot of other musicals.
Yeah. I just have to laugh because I feel like I know what Jay and Ryan now go through in their respective rabbit holes, because this conversation started with me asking you who gives the best supporting performance in the movie, and yet not only do we find ourselves talking about these musical performances, but we start talking about Llewyn Davis again anyway.
And also, look, it's a cyclical
It's all circular.
thing, right?
Yeah.
It's all circular.
Yeah,
it always
this movie
comes
has an
back to
effect.
Exactly.
I love it.
This is just a preview to next week while we're transitioning to that new format.
If you like what you hear, you're going to like what we're going to do next.
But yeah, I guess that is to say, to answer your question, it's probably Adam Driver because he's so funny. I love Carey Mulligan. She's great, one of my favorites. But in this film, Please, Mr. Kennedy, as I noted, one of the Coens' best comedic scenes, and it is driven by Adam Driver and whatever weird shenanigans he's doing in that song. It is so good.
Yeah.
So good. Yeah. And then there's also the moment you mentioned about his apartment. So yeah, I would say, yeah, it's got to be Adam Driver for me. He's the best.
It might be for me. I don't know. The more we talked about those scenes with the Gorfines, I might give it to Robin Bartlett, who plays Mrs. Gorfine.
Yeah. John Goodman is also very important to this movie as well.
He is. I wouldn't say his performance is the most challenging, though, because he's certainly doing a lot of his John Goodman-isms that he's so good at. I mean, that's not to knock his performance, but I sense more layers in the briefness of someone like Robin Bartlett, so I think there's more of a challenging performance out of her, at least.
But then again, I mean, there's the comedic flavor with Adam Driver, but in terms of the importance of the supporting characters here, I'd say it is Robin. She does carry the most heft, I think.
I think so.
Dramatically and emotionally.
Carey Mulligan does as well, but the script sort of asks that of her. I mean, her dialogue is very reflective of that. Perhaps there's more of a literal component to that character's arc. Again, not a bad thing, but I think when we're comparing these supporting performances, I think it just emphasized that I think someone like Robin Bartlett has the more challenging performance then, because her dialogue is not suggesting those things. She has to convey it in her own way, and that's a harder thing to do.
I agree. And I love Carey Mulligan, but if I'm being honest, I don't think this is her strongest work. What she does here is more than effective. It's certainly fine. But I agree. I don't like her performance here isn't going to land any sort of nomination at the InSession Film Awards for me. This film, from a performative standpoint, is the Oscar Isaac show, and he carries this in tremendous ways. He should have won the Oscar that year for Best Actor, as far as I'm concerned anyway. I know there's Leo. Yeah. People love Leo and Wolf. For me, it is not even close. It is Oscar Isaac in this film.
I'm with you.
And as far as the second best performance here, I think I'm with you. It probably is Robin Bartlett and what she's asked to do and how she perhaps goes above and beyond what she's tasked with. And it's really great. So yeah, but all the performances on the whole are more than effective. All right. Any other final thoughts from you?
Good movie. Good movie. I really want to. I'm looking at the Coen Brothers filmography now. This is at least top 3 for me, but I don't know. I'm so partial to Fargo. It was perhaps the first movie I really saw of theirs. Bit of a common pick, but I think it's a wonderful movie. And I also love Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? That is perhaps the best Southern live action cartoon I think I've ever seen. But this is the one I think about the most. I get the most of an emotional response from Inside Llewyn Davis when looking at the overarching Coen brothers filmography. So if we're looking at it in that way, I think it's perhaps their strongest film, maybe even their smartest film, if I'm being honest, because there is that tricky and sneaky way of conveying these things, and I think they do it with a lot of grace and fluidity. Not that they never do, but I think even more so this time around.
I completely agree. I love the Coen brothers. I mean, looking at my top 10 of their films, I mean, they're all very strong. Mm-hmm. They're all very good. Some of the best films of their given years. But I am with you. I think this is arguably their smartest screenplay. It's certainly their most melancholic. And it's also very funny. It carries the Coen flavor in terms of the humor that we often see in their films. Mm-hmm. But you think about their dramatic work, and while it's not as stark as something like No Country for Old Men, what we see here in terms of the emotional pathos of Llewyn and the drama that accompanies him, it's still rigorous. It's still very good. So there's an argument to be made that it's their most balanced film. It has all of the Coen flavors. I think that's the thing. Yeah, it is easily their most balanced film. At least I can certainly make that argument. All of their films have a dose of comedy to them. I can't think of one Coen brothers film that doesn't have at least one or two moments that I cackle pretty loudly. I mean, even No Country for Old Men, which has this sinister aura that almost can be perceived as seriousness. There are moments that are really funny in that film too. And I love how they throw those little jabs in there, even when they're not making a direct comedy. Yeah. Or something like A Serious Man that has serious in the title.
It's not that serious.
Has great humor in that movie. Or Barton Fink, as dramatically engrossing as that gets by the end, similarly has some great moments of humor in it as well. So yeah, I'm with you. All of their films have some sort of humor in it. And Llewyn Davis is full of great humor, but as we're talking about, it certainly balances out that levity with this incredible emotional journey that we go on with Llewyn, and that duality that we've been talking about with him, that yes, he is often quite abrasive at times, he is boorish, but what's driving those actions is this deep grief. And I think there's great empathy to be had with Llewyn because of the choices that the Coens make in their direction, but also with their script. It's just so great. I love the craft here. I know we haven't talked too much about the cinematography, but I do love that brown and hazy aesthetic we get.
Yeah.
The period aesthetics is fantastic. The editing here is really great. The music and the sound mixing, everything that goes into this film from a craft perspective is just really fantastic. And I also just love the surprise factor that it is this phenomenal film about identity and grief, which that on its own terms, I don't know if I expected walking into the movie. But then, as you noted at the beginning of this, it's also grief not of a child or of a parent, but of a friend, of a partner, of a music partner. You just don't see that very often. And I think the film tackles that with great diligence because those losses still hurt. And for Llewyn, from what we know, it doesn't seem as if he has a close relationship with his father. Not even sure if his mother is mentioned all that much. He doesn't seem very close with his sister as well. His life was centered around music and Mikey. And that has been stripped from him in some ways. And of course, he struggles throughout the film to accept it. And then by the end comes to terms with it. And that leads to my last final thought here. And you somewhat stole my thought here, Brendan.
Sorry.
No, that's perfectly fine because I also wanted to know Dave Van Ronk as Llewyn is inspired by his career and his music. And as we noted, it isn't a biography.
Right.
Llewyn is a fictional character, but heavily inspired by Dave Van Ronk. And if you go and read about his career, he, and I don't think this is a spoiler to say, is more successful than where we leave Llewyn at the end of this film.
Yeah.
But given what we know about Dave Van Ronk, his collaborations or his efforts to help champion a Bob Dylan, if you will, and young folk singers of the time. That helped project Van Ronk onto the folk scene. And then eventually he became this successful musician, producer of that genre. Mm-hmm. I love Llewyn. I just want to imagine that after the series of events that we see here, that he also went on to have a successful career. That's my future projection of Llewyn. I think
one
he makes
can only hope. Yeah, I would hope so as well. But the fact that we are choosing to, or that we're at least hoping that would be the case, that speaks a lot about the character and how we sympathize with him.
Absolutely. I'm absolutely projecting, but I love him so much and I want him to succeed. And since this is based off of Van Ronk, at least in some ways, I'm going to choose that. I'm choosing to
I
believe
think that's fair.
That he eventually gets over his grief and
he makes
Mikey proud.
He made
it. Yeah. Anyway, with all of that said, I love Inside Llewyn Davis so much. We've talked about it many times on the show. If you want to go and see any other thoughts we've done with Llewyn, just search Inside Llewyn Davis on the website. Plenty of content there.
Too much content.
Yeah, baby. And of course, I have thoughts at Letterboxd if you want to continue this conversation over there at letterboxd.com/InSessionFilm.
You can also let us know your thoughts on Inside Llewyn Davis by leaving us a comment on our Facebook page at facebook.com/InSessionFilm. You could also tweet us at InSessionFilm or respond to us on Instagram, also at InSessionFilm. Or, like this review that we just had here, email us your thoughts in long form at InSessionFilm@gmail.com.
All right, stay tuned. We're going to take a quick break here, and on the other side, we'll talk about our top 10 movies of 2013. Mm-hmm. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hang me, oh, hang me. I'll be dead and gone. Hang me, oh, hang me. I'll be dead and gone. Wouldn't mind the hanging, but the laying in the grave so long, poor boy, I've been all around this world. I've been all around Cape Girardeau, parts of Arkansas, all around Cape Girardeau, parts of Arkansas. I got so goddamn hungry I could hide behind the straw. Poor boy, been all around this world.
Remember the little dog, big dog exercise? Okay, little dog. Do it! Come on! Push, 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 push. Medium dog. Big dog. You're embarrassed? Really? Everyone! Little dog, big dog. Come on. And pants! Pants! Push. Medium dog. Big dog. Engage your core. Blow it out.
A clip there from the film Coda. You may remember that film. It won Best Picture not too long ago.
Yeah.
And everyone agreed with that choice. We're obviously not going to be talking about the contention or the conversation around the movie Coda, but we're using that as inspiration, or at least this clip is inspiring for us to talk about our favorite Sundance movies. So as we get into this new structure with the main show next weekend, JD, one thing we chose to start off with was doing our top 5 favorite movies that premiered at Sundance. Now, obviously, Sundance is happening right now as we speak. There's a lot to talk about there. And Coda was one of the big hits from that specific year from Sundance. So it prompted us to look back at the years past for that festival and what films it led to that became sometimes phenomenons. And we're going to be talking about our top 5 favorites.
Absolutely. Very much looking forward to this new format and new structure. As we noted in the intro, the camaraderie of Ryan and Jay, that joining us here weekly is going to be a lot of fun. But addition to that, it'll give us more flexibility to do top 5 list, which, as some of you may have seen over the last few years, it's gotten a little bit more challenging to do with the length of the shows being what they are, and us wanting to keep up.
I miss those so much.
I do as well, but I've really enjoyed getting to do the movie series. We did several of them in 2022 that were so rewarding and wonderful. And then, of course, by the end of the year, things get so busy with so many good movies coming out that we just didn't have time to get into any sort of top 3 or top 5 list. Mm-hmm. So with us doing the reviews as separate podcasts, as separate entities that will live on their own, it'll give us so much more flexibility to have these looser conversations, these Ryan and Jay rabbit holes, as we joked about in the intro as well. And to just have conversations like, let's talk about our favorite movies that premiered at Sundance and get into some fun shenanigans having that conversation. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then there's the video component as well. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Like you said, so many good movies have premiered at Sundance over the years. Say what you will about Coda, but it was a huge hit.
It's a cute movie.
It's a cute, good movie. I really like it. But yeah, there's been some really great films. 2013, you remember what won the Sundance Prize in 2013?
I'm trying to remember.
Fruitvale Station. A very good movie.
I have thoughts about that as we get to the second half of the show.
So there you go. I mean, a really good movie from 2013 that may or may not end up in someone's top 10 or top 20. That premiered at Sundance that year. So yeah, there's going to be a lot to talk about.
A lot to talk about, not just around Sundance. Maybe we'll use it as an opportunity to talk very briefly about some of our favorite sports movies. There's a movie coming out called 80 for Brady that I'm not sure if I'm going to see. I know Jay is going to see because it detailed the Patriots and Falcons Super Bowl specifically. So, but maybe we'll talk sports movies at the tail end of that episode. But yeah, look out for next week as we take a stab at this new structure, talking about Sundance.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be really great. So everybody stay tuned, subscribe, youtube.com/InSession Film. Okay, before we get to the next segment, I also want to plug Women in Session, where Zita and Kristen, they got together to talk about the career of the great Robert Mitchum.
Yeah.
He's done so many good movies. And it was a really fascinating conversation. I especially loved what they had to say regarding him in The Night of the Hunter, which is one of my favorite movies ever, I think. It's so good.
Movie. Yeah.
He's great in that film. But yeah, it was a fascinating conversation. Definitely urge people to go and check that out. Episode 22, Robert Mitchum Retrospective. And if you want to support the show, there's a couple of ways that you can do that. Patreon.com/InSession Film is a great way to support us. But we also have some great sponsors that we love you to check out as well.
Yeah. We talk about ourselves being a podcast, a lot of great podcast content out there, but it's not the only kind of content. Sometimes the great content comes in the form of audiobooks, news articles. You can find all of these available at Audible, audible.com specifically. And if you go to audibletrial.com/InSessionFilm, you'll be able to download a free audiobook and get a 30-day free trial by going to that specific link. Everything that they offer is compatible for your iPhone, your Android, your Kindle, MP3 player, if you still have one of those things. But their library, Audible specifically, has... if you think it takes a long time to simply scroll through a streaming platform trying to find something that you want to watch, the same thing happens on Audible trying to find something that you want to read up on. The content is endless, but there's so much great stuff there, whether it's a popular fantasy novel like The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, Harry Potter, all available there. News articles and podcasts hosted by some of your favorite celebrities, also available on Audible. So once again, audibletrial.com/InSessionFilm. If you sign up there, you'll get a 30-day free trial and a free audiobook download.
Hello, geeks and geekettes. I'm Steve Megatron, and if you're looking for a podcast that covers a vast array of geeky topics, then check out Altered Geek. Altered Geek covers superheroes, Star Trek, pop culture, comics, film, television, animation, gaming, tech, and more. So check out Altered Geek and get altered, get geeky with the Altered Geeks every Friday on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, SoundCloud, Blog Talk Radio, and the Geekcast Radio Network.
I'm Clint.
And I'm Jared.
And we're the hosts of the podcast Alcohollywood,
your source for inebriation,
which you're not listening to right now because this is just a promo for a weekly podcast on all kinds of movies. New, old, good, bad.
Yeah, especially bad.
Plus, we invent a cocktail and a drinking game inspired by each film.
And sometimes we make jokes. Not this time, but sometimes.
Subscribe to us on your favorite podcatcher and check out the whole shebang at alcohollywood.com.
This podcast is a proud member of the Lamb Podcasting Network. Find the network at largeassmovieblogs.com.
You're listening to the InSession Film Podcast. This is episode 518, and as we round out this specific episode, really this Inside Llewyn Davis episode as it primarily was, we still want to talk about the year 2013. This is a very nostalgic year for us, more so for you, JD. You were obviously here as the creator of InSession Film at that time. I didn't join in 2013. I came on in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe not quite as nostalgic for me, but the sentiment is there nonetheless. But for InSession Film, it is. It's a 10-year birthday here. And we thought we'd look at the year 2013, see what may have changed for us and how we feel about the year, especially as our critical minds have morphed and evolved and changed with time. We did something rather similar last year, JD, when we talked about Zero Dark 30 at the end of our 2021 campaign. Then we looked at the year 2012. We didn't do an actual top 10 segment, but what we did do was reveal what our top 10 lists were at that time and talk about how we felt about them, what has changed now, what our new top 10s are, and maybe talk about what those changes are now and as far as how they're reflective of our current minds. That's what we're going to do here. It's going to be more of a informal conversation about the year, but let's go ahead and get to it. I think the way to kick this off, JD, is maybe first off, let's talk about 2013, what you thought of the year, why we tend to look at it as one of the best years of this particular decade. And why don't you go ahead and say what your top 10 was? You had two initial top 10s of sorts because you had it way back in 2013. We obviously redid that when we prepped our best of the decade episode. Yeah. Maybe things have changed even further a third time. I don't know. But let's see. Let's talk about 2013, what your favorites were, and what may have changed.
So I am still very much in love with 2013. I don't know if it's subjective to me. Now, I would make an argument that it's one of the best years for film we've had in the last 10 years. Two of the films in my top 10, my number one and number two, I think are two of the best films of the 2010s. But I don't think it stops there. I think when you look at top 10 movies of that year, the top 20 movies of that year, it is really deep. I think there's a great variance to it. It was a good year for documentary, a very good year for documentary, a very good year for foreign language film. And then there's Hollywood, and I think they perhaps started out a little bit rough, but by the end of the year, I think it ended on a very strong note. But 2013 for me also, and this might be a little bit of a weird analogy because, as we've mentioned a couple of times, it was our first year doing InSession Film. And there is something about it being our first year that is special to me. I correlate it to that first love of your life that you might not be with anymore, but no one can ever take away that first love. Like, there's such a unique and special bond to being in love with that first person that just carries with you the rest of your life.
Those feelings will always be there,
for
better or for worse.
Exactly. Those feelings will always be there. And I feel the same way about 2013 as it relates to InSession Film, regardless of where cinema takes us as we move into the future, wherever InSession Film takes us into the future.
Yeah.
There's something about 2013 that just holds a special place in my heart. And then on top of that, I just think it was a very good year for movies. So looking back at the movies of that year, looking at my original top 10 list, I am feeling sentimental about it in all honesty. So this is going to be a lot of fun. But so here was my original top 10 as it was back in 2013. And while this list has changed, my feelings on these 10 movies have not. I still love these 10 movies. At number 10 for me, About Time. Yes, I put About Time in my top 10.
It might be Richard Curtis's best movie.
It's so good. I love it. Man, that film hit me emotionally in ways that I just did not anticipate, that I just did not see coming. This rom-com that turns into this father-son relationship is just so good.
Oh, yeah.
I love it. At number 9 for me, Ron Howard's best film, Rush. Oh, my God. Love that movie.
It's up there. I
love it. Daniel Bruhl
yep.
should have been nominated for an Oscar.
Yeah.
Throwing that out there.
Okay. I like when Ron Howard sticks to biopics. I think that's when he does some of his better films.
I agree. And Hans Zimmer's score, so underrated. It is one of his best scores that nobody talks about, but I think it's really great. Now, what he does in 2014, the next year, probably his best score. I do think Interstellar is his best work, but 2013, his most underrated. Number 8 for me, Alexander Payne's Nebraska. Maybe that's a little controversial, but I think it is his best movie.
It's a good movie.
And earlier, I mentioned that Oscar Isaac should have won Best Actor. Bruce Dern, if it wasn't going to be Oscar Isaac, I wanted it to be Bruce Dern to win the Oscar. I don't know if he was up for lead or supporting. Either way, I wanted him to win.
I think he was up for lead.
Up for lead,
sure for that, yeah.
Either way, I was very much rooting for him. It was never going to be him, but it's Bruce Dern. He's so great in that movie. Love him. That film is hilarious.
Yeah.
Number 7 for me was Harmony Korine's Spring Breakers. I'm sure we'll talk about that more as we go here. At number 6 for me was Richard Linklater's Before Midnight. And number 5 was 12 Years a Slave. Number 4 was Gravity. Number 3, Inside Llewyn Davis. It took a second watch to get there.
Yeah.
But eventually that landed at number 3. And then number 2, Blue is the Warmest Color. And then number 1 for me was Her, Spike Jonze's Her.
Yep.
Love that top 10. I still love all of those movies.
I think I like all those movies as well. Some of them, a lot of them, crossing over into mine.
Okay, well, let's get to the best of the decade episode, 363. And as Brendan noted, when we did that episode, part of the exercise was that we revisited all of our top 10 list of the decade.
That was a big part of the exercise, as well as trying to find hidden blind spots that we didn't get a chance to see, which was also a big part of it.
Absolutely. So that shifted some of our list. And 2013 for me did see some reshuffling. So when we did that episode, again, 363, this was at the beginning of 2020, my list for 2013 shifted to this. At number 1, Inside Llewyn Davis. That did finally make the jump.
Now. Yeah.
For all the reasons we talked about for over an hour earlier.
Yeah. Movie's okay.
Yeah, it did okay.
It's not bad. Pretty good.
Not bad. And number 2, still Spike Jonze's Her. And while we haven't talked about it much yet on this episode, we've talked about Her many times here on the show. I think it is absolutely brilliant. It's hard to say. He's done so many great films. It's probably my favorite, but Spike Jonze's filmography is so wonderful.
It's so interesting.
It's like picking children.
It is, but it's so interesting. I mean, I'm always going to be partial to Where the Wild Things Are, as you know.
And it was my favorite film of that year, too.
Yeah.
So,
but when you have movies like Being John Malkovich and Adaptation, they almost feel like co-efforts with Spike Jonze and Charlie Kaufman in some ways. You know, they kind of veer off, and I almost feel like in some ways Spike Jonze's true debut was Where the Wild Things Are. At least I feel like the argument can be made in that way, but if we are including all 4 of those films, none of them are bad at all. They're all great.
And in any other year, her is my number one, except for maybe 2018, because First Man just hit me so uniquely. But in most
2 movies
other
about
years,
grief sounds like a theme you like.
I know. In most other years, though, her is my number one. And without Llewyn Davis, it easily would have been my number one here. So that's my number 2. At number 3, Spring Breakers makes the jump from 7 to 3. And number 4 for me is Before Midnight. 5 for me is 12 Years a Slave. 6, Blue is the Warmest Color. 7, the documentary The Act of Killing.
Yeah.
So that was originally in my 11 through 20. I think it sat at 13 or 14 on that original list. And then it jumps up to number 7. Then at number 8 for me is Nebraska. That stays. At number 9 is Gravity. And then at number 10 is Rush. So episode 363, Best of the Decade, that's where I landed with my top 10 of 2013 at that time.
Not too many changes. It feels more like a reshuffling than there are massive changes.
Yeah, it was a big reshuffling. Really, the only injection into the top 10 was The Act of Killing.
Yeah.
And that made a significant jump. But yeah, it was mostly a reshuffling. And that was a major process still. But yeah, most of the films stayed the same.
Yeah, so there's not many changes there. I think what's interesting about 2013, while it is certainly nostalgic for us, and while I wasn't on InSession Film in 2013, that came a year later, it was a time when I was getting more serious about keeping up to date with newer movies and just enjoying them as an expensive hobby of sorts, maybe eventually doing something with them critically. You know, it was certainly a pipe dream at the time that now came into fruition as we've been doing this for 10 years.
Sure.
But looking at the films themselves, there's a lot of experimentation with these movies. I feel like in some ways 2013 is kind of a transitional year artistically, because ever since then we've seen a lot more movies take bold directional chances that are sometimes even rewarded within the award circuit. You know, 2013 and onward is when we start seeing movies like, going a few years later, a movie like Parasite winning Best Picture, or Birdman winning Best Picture. And say what you will about Birdman, it's not really a typical Best Picture winning kind of film.
It isn't. Same with The Shape of Water. That's a movie about a woman falling in love with a man-fish.
Yeah,
I mean, that is not the Academy's history.
When you say it that way, for sure. The execution has a traditional sense to it, which I love about the movie, but when you say the narrative, there's no way the Academy will go for a movie like that in the early 2000s, we'll simply say.
Exactly,
So I feel like 2013 was kind of a transitional year in that regard, which is why I think we hold it in such high regard, because it does have a bold quality to its movies. I feel like that was a reoccurring theme in a lot of ways. And I love this year as well. My top 10 that I first put together was that Best of the Decade episode, episode 363, I believe it was. I certainly had some favorites, but the first one I think I ever really compiled for the sake of InSession Film was for that episode and the preparation I did for it. So my top 10 at that time was Short Term 12 at number 10, Fruitvale Station at number 9.
There it is. Yeah.
Blue is the Warmest Color at number 8, The Act of Killing at number 7, Edgar Wright's The World's End at number 6, which is still my favorite Edgar Wright film, which might be a bit of a hot take, I guess, but it is my favorite of his. Number 5, Nebraska. Number 4, Inside Llewyn Davis.
There it is.
Number 3, Spring Breaker. Actually, no, I take it back. Number 3 was Before Midnight.
Yes.
Number 2 was Spring Breakers. That was the actual list there. That leaves Spike Jonze's Her at number 1. So that was my list that I put together there. But I'm curious, JD, as we look at the year with our current eyes, has anything changed for you?
Slightly, yes.
Okay.
Before I get into mine, though, I'm curious to hear more from you. I want to know if yours changed or what changed on your list. Did anything change on your list?
I love that you're posing it to me first, because I tend to be the one that changes things more drastically.
Yes. And oftentimes it's films that I never see coming. Like, it's usually a little bit out of left field.
We saw this when we did this last year, JD, for our 2012 retrospective. I made some massive changes on my newly updated top 10 list there. A movie like Killing Them Softly, the Andrew Dominik film, ended up at like number 7. And it was nowhere near my top 20 when I did that list initially. So I'll say this now.
I say that to say I'm waiting for something like All Is Lost or Drinking or Pain & Gain is now in Brendan's top at number 7. Like that's kind of what I'm waiting on here.
I think I'm going to disappoint you. I think I'm going to disappoint you. Okay. My new top 10 list, as it stands right now, as we're recording this, it's not that different. No, it's not that different. Only 2 films dropped out of my top 10 of the old top 10. And to be perfectly honest, they kind of dropped off pretty significantly. I'll just say right now, those 2 films that they're kind of out of my top 20 now. That's Blue is the Warmest Color and Fruitvale Station.
Oh, wow.
And I still really like those movies, but I think as I've gotten older, you'll notice a theme here. I've become a bit more emotionally attached to intimate, personal, human movies that are a bit less sociopolitical, if that makes sense. And that's not a knock on those respective movies at all. I still really like them. It's just I've latched on to different things as I've gotten older, which is why within my new top 10 right now at number 10, I have Frances Ha at number 10.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. The Noah Baumbach film starring Greta Gerwig, who she co-wrote with Noah Baumbach. In some ways, this almost feels more like a Greta Gerwig debut than it does a Noah Baumbach film.
Sure.
The French new waviness of it, I feel like, has a tone that almost bled into Lady Bird a little bit. There's something about it. I really liked watching it again as a 33-year-old man, trying to relate to someone that was going through a time in her life where she didn't have it all together. At the time when I was younger, seeing it for the first time, I didn't get it. I just didn't get it. But now I do.
What's interesting about that film is in 2013, I was not familiar with Greta Gerwig. I wasn't even all that familiar with Noah Baumbach, if I'm being perfectly honest. Baumbach and Gerwig are figures that I have come to love, but over the course of time as doing this show. So back in 2013, it didn't even make my top 20. Yeah, and then when we redid these lists for best of the decade, I did have that in my 11 through 20.
Okay.
And it now sits at number 15 for me. So it has increasingly gotten higher and higher on this list. So who knows, in another 5 or 10 years, maybe it'll eventually crack the top 10. I mean, who knows? That seems to be the trajectory it's on. But it is a film I have come to, like Inside Llewyn Davis. The more I think about it, the more I sit on it, the more I watch it, I've come to really love more and more.
They're kind of similar in some ways. I feel like you can almost lump the two of those films together, Llewyn Davis and Frances Ha, as weird companion pieces of sorts, like the New York artistic ventures of lost souls. There is maybe some comparisons to be had there in their own respective ways. So the fact that we're talking this deeply about a movie like this on an episode where we just talked about Inside Llewyn Davis might be appropriate. But yeah, at this point now, just given my current emotional headspace, a movie like Frances Ha now lands at my number 10 spot. We're going to get a lot of repeats now, though. At number 9 is Short Term 12. Number 8, The Act of Killing. Number 7, The World's End. Number 6, Nebraska. Number 5, the new addition to this list, Hirokazu Koreeda's Like Father, Like Son.
Okay.
And maybe I just still have Koreeda on the brain after seeing Broker not too long ago as we wrapped up our 2022 campaign. But I'm a Koreeda head now. I'm a Koreeda head at the moment. So we'll see if it holds there as the years go on. Now, the rest of my top 4 are mostly the same. The order has shuffled a little bit. Before Midnight is now at my number 4. Spring Breakers number 3. Inside Llewyn Davis number 2. And Her is number 1.
Okay. That's really interesting. I am now angry with you. That's
okay.
The revelation I've come to realize here, because
you were hoping for something more surprising, weren't you?
No. Well, yes, but mostly what I'm referring to is that I have forever on this show been the champion of Hirokazu Koreeda. I am
You've been the Koreeda
OG
head.
Koreeda head.
I'm taking that title from you now.
Maybe, because I've always loved Like Father, Like Son. I've talked about it several times here on the show. It's made several top 3 lists for me.
Mm-hmm.
It sits at number 13 on my list. It's always been a part of my 2013 list. I absolutely love and adore that movie.
Haven't you cited it as your favorite Corretto film before?
I've gone back and forth on it because I love Nobody Knows. That is my favorite film of 2005. I believe that came out.
Yes, that's right.
And then, of course, now there's Shoplifters, Broker. I mean, everything the guy does is phenomenal. I go back and forth between Like Father, Like Son, Shoplifters, and Nobody Knows.
Okay.
Those are my top 3, but everything the guy does, I absolutely adore.
Yeah. I really like Still Walking quite a bit.
Still
it's one of
Walking
his
is
lesser,
very good.
I don't want to say lesser, but it's one of his more subtle films. It doesn't quite have the narrative propulsion of something like Father, Like Son, which some of these movies that take the questionable family dynamics more literally have more plot, we'll simply say, more conflict around them. But I think he handles it very well in those respects.
I agree. No, I agree. Our Little Sister, I think, is very good as well.
Yeah.
There's much to like about Hirokazu Koreda. Like Father, Like Son, though, is one of my top 3 Koreda films. And as I noted, it's always been on this list in one way or another. And similarly to what I was saying about her, Like Father, Like Son in most other years would easily be in my top 10. In fact, looking here at my top 10 list for all the other years that we've covered since doing this show, I do think it would make it onto my list when I look at something like 2016, for example.
Okay.
2017, it definitely lands on that list. 2018, well, that's the Shoplifters of the year, so
yeah,
I'll leave that alone. 2019, probably. 2020, definitely.
Oh, yeah.
It's on this list. So, yeah, in a lot of other years, it makes my top 10. But 2013, I just feel like is so deep and rich that I struggled to find a spot there in the 10. But like I said on this last year's award show, I have 3-4 films here that might as well be 10 B, C, and D.
And this is one of them for this.
And this is one of them, absolutely. So I do consider this a top 10 movie, but math is a bitch.
Yeah.
So it is what it
Truer
is.
words have never been spoken.
So with that out of the way, as I get into my top 10, not much has changed for me either. There is one change, and that is Short Term 12. That's a film that originally on my list, I think was at 13. Yes, it sat at number 13 back in 2013. And then we did the best of the decade, and it was still outside my top 10. I think it might have moved up one spot to 12. And then when reconsidering it for this exercise, I made the change and put that in at 10. And then at number 11, and again, this is a 10B. I struggled with this. I went back and forth because at number 11 for me is Sarah Polley's Stories We Tell.
Oh, okay,
which
okay.
I think is one of the best docs. And it would have been in my top 10 if not for The Act of Killing. But The Act of Killing is
such an innovative documentary.
It is so innovative. So it's a little bit of a victim of The Act of Killing being what it is. Short Term 12 is really great. But those are interchangeable. And I still love Rush. I truly, genuinely believe Rush is one of the best films of 2013. It was the best surprise movie of that year for me. So Stories We Tell, Rush, and Like Father, Like Son, those are 10 B, C, and D for me. I love those movies. They might as well. I feel about them as top 10 movies of that year, if that makes sense.
I think that makes perfect sense.
But at number 10 for me is Short Term 12. Then at number 9 is Nebraska. 8 is Gravity. 7, The Act of Killing. 6, Blue is the Warmest Color. 5, 12 Years a Slave. 4, Before Midnight. 3, Spring Breakers. 2, Her. 1, Inside Llewyn Davis. So not too much changes. Other than the Short Term 12 flip-flop, and then rearranging a little bit in my 11 through 20. Like I said, Frances Ha jumps up to number 15. About Time is now at 17 for me. And then I round out my 18, 19, and 20 with The End, Mud, and The World's End. now cracks my top 20, which it was just outside previously.
Yeah. And I feel like this year, when it came to awards consideration, it was kind of a two-horse race, I feel like, between 12 Years a Slave and Gravity, at least between the tech movie and a more emotionally driven movie. And both of those still land in my top 20. I actually have 12 Years a Slave currently at like number 14-ish, Gravity around number 16. As far as theater-going experiences with Gravity specifically, it would have made my top 10 just for the fact it was that thrilling of an experience.
Yeah.
And maybe sometimes we have to consider those things. I would be very curious to sit on my top 20 for a little bit longer to see if anything still changes, because a lot of the movies I have here in my new revitalized top 20, some of them I feel like I still want to rewatch again. And they could change a little bit. A movie like, let's say, Paul Greengrass's Captain Phillips.
That's at number 14 for me. I still love that movie. Yeah.
Number 11 for me. There's also the film The Spectacular Now, which I did not get.
16 for me.
Okay, I didn't get a chance to rewatch that one yet, but given my current emotional headspace, the reason why I responded to a movie like Frances Ha so much differently now, I kind of wonder if I'll have a similar reaction to something like The Spectacular Now. So I do also have that in my top 20 as well. I'll also throw out Baz Luhrmann's The Great Gatsby.
I love it. I really like it. I'm sorry, I do. Yeah.
It is in my top 20. And you know what else is in my top 20? Iron Man 3 is in my top 20.
Okay. I mean, I have come around on that movie. I loathed it back in 2013.
Same here.
I have come to appreciate it as a Shane Black experience. I still have problems with it as a Marvel movie.
I think that's fair.
As a Shane Black movie, it's very good. And I do enjoy it way more than I did. The big changes for me in my 11 through 20 are Frances Ha jumping as high as it has, and then the additions of Mud and The World's End. But I go back and forth because I love The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby was in my 15 through 20 originally back in 2013.
You were always a defender of that.
I've always been a defender of it. I truly love it. But over time, I've become the Jeff Nichols guy.
Yeah,
and
fair.
Mud was... It's not only a great Jeff Nichols film, again, getting into kind of the gritty, earthy parts of America. It's also part of the reconnaissance of that time. And I think Matthew McConaughey is really great in that film.
Yeah, because this was also the year of Dallas Buyers Club, right?
Yes. Which is the lesser of the reconnaissance movies.
Probably the lesser performance as well.
Yeah. And of course, he went on to win the Oscar for...
Still very good in that movie. I'm not trying to knock it. But,
as a performance, he's very good. But I think he's better in Mud.
I like the nuances of Mud
I agree.
better.
Yeah, I agree. And The World's End, I really love for the same reasons you do as well. As far as a few other films fighting for a spot there, though, the documentary Blackfish, it is an agenda-driven film, but god dang, I love that movie still. It is really good.
Still a blind spot for me, I have to admit.
It's very it does not stray away from the really heart-wrenching details of what that story is about. It could have taken a lesser approach to be more attainable, and it doesn't do that. It wants to get into the rough areas of that story. So agenda-driven, yes, I will acknowledge, and that's maybe why it's slightly on the outside. But I think very good. All Is Lost. I still love that movie. That was fighting there. And then Pain and Gain. Like I've come around on Michael Bay's Pain and Gain so much. I thought about it. It's very close to making my top 20 as well.
Pain and Gain is fighting for that bottom of the top 20 spot.
Yeah.
I think I have it around like 21 right now. Some films could shuffle along with it because still within my top 20, I have movies like Blue Jasmine, the Woody Allen film.
I like Blue Jasmine.
The Place Beyond the Pines, I actually think is a pretty good movie. There's also Upstream Color, which is a movie I have to admit I still don't get, and I think that's why it's not higher. But as a meandering sci-fi romantic mood poem, I kind of vibe with it at times. I can't fully wrap my head around it.
And that was it for me as well. So back in 2013, originally that was number 12 on my list. That's how high I was on it. But for the same reasons, I don't know if I could articulate why I loved it. It's just the experience of that movie, like the energy it gives off, I think is engrossing. Now, it has fallen off for me. I have not revisited the film since. If I was to rewatch it, maybe it climbs back up the ranks and makes it to number 12 again. I don't know.
Maybe. Yeah.
I don't know. But because I can't really articulate it, it's just one of those movies you have to experience. And I just haven't had a chance to revisit it since. So it's fallen the ranks for me. But I do love it. It's still in my 21 through 25, though.
Yeah.
As well as Fruitvale Station, a film that I'm also very high on. I do want to defend Blue is the Warmest Color, though. I want to spend a few minutes on this movie because
I still really like it.
It's a movie that I know a lot of people have a problem with. And as I get into this, I just ask all of our listeners out there to just be open-minded for a moment, because I do know that this film is off-putting to people. And I understand why. When you look at the behind the scenes, I do not condone at all Abdelatif Kechiche and what he did to his actresses to provoke the performances out of them. I don't condone what he did.
Yeah.
And I understand that people are not only put off by his behavior, but the extended grotesqueness of the sex scenes in this film that aren't very realistic. They are very much driven from the male gaze perspective. And again, I don't disagree with that either. But my reasonings for loving it is this. One, it is a 3-hour movie. In fact, it is longer than 3 hours. The sex scenes combined are like 8 minutes of it.
Yeah.
So you're talking about a romance drama where 90% of it is about the relationship itself away from the bedroom. So that's part of it. I think you can also make an argument. While the sex isn't realistic, it has that male gaze shine to it for sure. I do think, though, from a certain angle, the length of it, the passion of the performers there, I do think is indicative of the idea that when you are first engaging in sex with your first love, as we see in this film, it is going to be that passionate and raw and perhaps even lengthy. And so I understand where he's coming from by depicting it that way. At least I interpret the length of them and the passion of it as this is a couple. This is their first relationship, at least with Adele. This is her first serious relationship. And so the sex is going to have that first passion vigor to it. And I think that comes through in the performances. I do think there's credence to that idea, even if the execution is flawed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. And I think if there's any reason why it's sort of lessened for me, well, it really comes down to two reasons. One, I've just never given myself the time to rewatch a 3-hour movie like this. And it is a challenging watch. It really is. And maybe that's just more on me. I need to take time to sit with it once again, have a fresher mind on it to see if it still holds true for me. And I guess the other reason is that it sort of falls into a similar category as something like Luca Guadagnino's Call Me By Your Name. Like there is a visual and sexual intensity to the sex scenes, even if they do come few and far between. I sometimes wonder maybe if it is suggesting something a bit more hedonic than it is romantic. But I do think if it really comes down to anything, the performances are just so good. Like what really sells this movie are the performances. And I wonder how the movie would have worked for me if it weren't for them. So it's more of a question than it is a criticism, if that makes sense. I just sometimes wonder that.
Yeah, I mean, that's very fair. And again, my interpretation of the sex scenes is that this is a couple in a relationship, and early on, the sex is going to be passionate. It's going to be vigorous, especially when it's your first love, which is what we're seeing with the Adele character. And appropriately so, I guess. I noted earlier when talking about 2013 as a whole, the whole analogy of I feel about that year as we do with the first loves in our lives. You just don't forget it. That's what this movie is. It's the story of Adele falling in love and having a serious relationship for the first time, and that fizzling out. Something we can all relate with, something that many of us have certainly experienced. And that, to me, is the heart of the movie. It is, again, the sex scenes are 8 minutes of a 3-hour movie. This is mostly about the relationship between those two girls.
But even so, sorry to cut you off, because in defense of your viewpoint of the movie as well, sometimes first love is perceived as being a bit sexually intense in that
exactly.
way.
That's ultimately what I'm getting at. Yeah.
Yeah, because children look at it in that way through this lens of naivete.
Exactly.
They sometimes see it that way.
They're young. When you're the ages of Emma and Adele here, there is a sexual charge when you're youthful and in a relationship like that for the first time. And so I think the passion behind them makes sense to me. Even though I disagree with the off-screen execution, how they come about, I do not condone or I do not agree with it.
Yeah.
But the idea, I understand where it's coming from. And again, you can throw all of that in the trash basket for all I care, because 90% of this film is about the relationship itself, what's driving their choices. It's the bond of these two young women, the love that they share and cherish, and then ultimately how that fizzles out by the end. And the performances here are so good. Leah Seydoux is great, one of the best supporting performances of the year. And if Oscar Isaac is the male performance of 2013, Adele Exarchopoulos is the female performance of that year. All due respect to Cate Blanchett, whom I adore. But Adele Exarchopoulos gives the female performance of that year, of 2013.
I think that's an argument
to
be had.
Film.
Yeah, I can agree with that. Or at least I'd have to do all the math and look at everyone that was up for contention there. But I think she's really good in that movie.
I think she's very good. I didn't look this up before the show, but I'm pretty sure I even nominated her for Best Actress for Best of the Decade when we did that exercise. I think she's that good. I think she's absolutely incredible in this film. So the performances, the camaraderie of that relationship, the love, the inner workings of it that we've all experienced, and then how that falls apart, the just true, genuine, sincere heartbreak that comes at the end, I think is really felt because of, again, how the film emphasizes that relationship between these two people and the nuances at play in all of it. That's mostly what this film is. And the performances make it work. So, again, I understand the pushback. I don't disagree with the pushback. I truly don't. But I think there's, as a film, separating the bullshit from the artist, if you will, I think the film itself has a lot to offer, and I still think it's great.
Well, this does it for our mini review of Blue is the Warmest Color, which I honestly did not expect the conversation to go this way. But
I didn't either.
It is kind of warranted. Perhaps it was a bit necessary. But as we transition back to 2013, are there any thoughts to round out this conversation that you had, JD, as we look back on the year very fondly and what we think about it?
No, I just think it's really great. I think it's a deep year. What's interesting to me about the evolution of my original list to the reshuffling of the best of the decade version to even now, I think about what this list could look like in another 5 years or another 10 years. The year is so good and so deep that I don't think the reshuffling will ever cease.
Oh, it'll never stop. Same for me. Honestly, I think with this new show structure we're going to be doing with the main show going forward, we're still going to have to do these retrospectives every 10 years.
Yeah, I completely agree because it will evolve. And I think that's the beauty of it, that in another 10 years, not only will films from my 11 through 20 maybe push into the top 10, but films completely from the outside that maybe we haven't even mentioned yet that climbs the ranks into the top 20 there. Because another film that we haven't mentioned yet that I keep thinking about all the time, and this isn't one that many people saw, I don't think, and I don't know if I would say it's objectively one of the top 20 movies of the year. But Drinking Buddies is a movie that I have come to love so much.
Oh, yeah.
That, I could see.
It's kind of my intro to mumblecore.
Yeah. Like, it's one of the best mumblecore movies in recent years, hands down.
Yeah.
And I could see.
That's a good point.
I could see it cracking that 20 spot at some point. I just subjectively have come to love it so much.
I think the one movie that would most likely keep rising for me and maybe end up in my top 20 at some point is Sofia Coppola's The Bling Ring.
Yeah, that's what I'm curious about. Yes.
Yeah. I like it. It's kind of in that 3.5 out of 5 star range for me at the moment. But I feel like that movie has been getting a slight reappraisal over the past few years, so maybe now's the time to watch it. Maybe I should have watched it in preparation for this discussion. So if I watch it in a couple days, I might come back and say, JD, I made a mistake. Got to redo my list now.
I think
it's my number 4 movie of the year.
That's perfectly understandable. I know I really like Soderbergh's Side Effects from that year, maybe more than a lot of others.
I thought that was pretty good. Not my favorite Soderbergh, but I thought it was thrilling.
Yeah, I really like it. There's also The Hunt that might crack this top 20 at some point. I need to revisit the film because there's the performance by Mads Mikkelsen that I think is one of the best performances of the year. The film itself, I can't put it in my top 20 yet because I just feel like I have to revisit it to really see. But it's what I thought about, especially because Mikkelsen and how much that we come to love him. And then another film I've thought about too, and I know at the time it got mixed reviews, but I'm way higher on it than most people, and that's Park Chan-wook's Stoker. I really love that movie quite a bit.
Okay. I'm looking at other films from 2013 to see what we may have missed that we acknowledge. There are 2 other films that I know were very popular from this year. I mean, obviously, one of them being Martin Scorsese's The Wolf of Wall Street.
Oh, yeah, there is that movie. Yeah.
There is that movie. I like it.
Yeah.
It's nowhere near my top 20.
Yeah.
I'll say that.
Uh-huh.
There's also Denis Villeneuve's Prisoners.
Yeah. Yeah,
that's far and away my least favorite Denis Villeneuve film,
Okay.
and it's honestly not even close. I'm very mixed on that one, but I acknowledge it has its fans. The foreign language film, The Great Beauty, is one I haven't had a chance to see again. I've only seen it once, so that's kind of a lingering one for me.
Yeah.
I'm trying to see what else there is. Some of these that I'm seeing on this quick list, I know we technically counted for us as 2014 films, even if they may have gotten early festival runs in 2013, such as Under the Skin, for instance, or Ida or Snowpiercer. Some movies like that kind of fell into this like back and forth.
And maybe we should note that because historically we've always counted these films based off of their limited releases the year prior, which is why something like Under the Skin is a 2014 film. Because a lot of these films just play at festivals the year before, and on IMDb, that's all they care about, so they list it as a 2013 movie, when its limited release run was probably in early 2014. And so that can be a little bit confusing, I guess. We've always counted them based off of their limited release runs, for the most part anyway.
Yeah, that's good to speculate that so our audience is aware. But looking at a few others just to call out in case our listeners are wondering, I know you, JD, were a bigger fan of David O. Russell's American Hustle than I was. And I think to this day you're still positive on that film.
I am.
Yeah, certainly more so than I am. I'm very mixed on it. There's The Grandmaster, the Wong Kar-wai movie, which I don't really care for.
Yeah, I wasn't a big fan either.
I love Wong Kar-wai, but I think I don't know if he's the best suited for that kind of action film. I don't know. I was a little mixed on that one, but it's been a while. I should watch that one again.
Yeah, I wasn't a big fan of that either. American Hustle is a film that I do like. I don't love it. it's not in my top 20. It was in my 11 through 20 back in 2013. And I'm going to be killed by this, Brendan, but I actually had it ranked higher than The Wolf of Wall Street, even back in 2013.
I definitely don't agree with that. But okay, good for you for being that daring to open up about that.
Look, at this point, I have nothing to hide. It's all about truth and honesty. Now, I don't know if I feel that way now. I'm
right.
Again, like, don't love. I feel the same way about The Wolf of Wall Street. I think there's plenty to like about that movie, but ultimately I'm way more mixed on it than most people are. So, I mean, take that for what it's worth. But I mean, of the two films, do I like Wolf better than American Hustle? Probably. Yeah, I think it's a better crafted movie. There's no doubt about that. I think maybe at the time I was more frustrated with Wolf because you sense the greatness of it, and then it just becomes overly redundant and a little exploitative, and I think my frustrations kind of soured when it came to my ranking, if that makes sense. So
yeah, that makes sense. I think I felt the same way.
Yeah, I mean, if you're asking me to compare and pit those two movies up against one another, look, you're not going to get much passion out of me one way or another. So
we might get more passion out of you if we talk about Pacific Rim instead.
Well, yeah, see, that's a film from that year that I'm way higher on than either of those two movies, which might get me in trouble even further with the Scorsese fans out there.
I mean, it's fun.
I love it. I think it's really great. Honestly, of the blockbusters that year, unless you're counting Rush as it's a studio film. I don't know if I'd count it as a blockbuster though, but it's probably my favorite of the blockbusters that year. Even though I've come around on Iron Man 3, I have a special love for Pacific Rim. I just think it is balls to the walls fun.
Well, they're certainly all better than The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug.
Oh God. Yeah. Don't remind me. Catching Fire came out that year and that was pretty great.
Oh, it did. Yeah. Yeah, that one's pretty good.
So I guess Catching Fire is the best, but my heart still lies with Pacific Rim. So, yeah.
Yeah, I might give it to Iron Man 3 at least, looking at this list in front of me now, it's probably the first one I can think of as far as blockbusters are concerned.
And I don't hate Frozen like a lot of people do. I think people
I like it.
People hate Frozen because it took the zeitgeist by storm, pun intended, I guess.
Oh, and nice work there.
And that drove a lot of people crazy. But the thing is, Frozen is a movie that's making fun of itself, making fun of its own formula. And
that's an interesting viewpoint.
The self-awareness of it, I think, is really fantastic. It's a film that knows exactly what it's doing in that regard. And so I actually think it's pretty good, way better than its reputation. And, it's not a film that's going to crack my top 20 or anything, but I'll defend it.
Right.
I'll defend it.
All right. Defend away. That's the whole point of this show.
Yeah.
I'll certainly take it over Monsters University from that year.
Yeah. I liked Monsters University. I mean, I certainly don't love it, but I think I liked it maybe a little bit more than most.
I like it less every time I watch even just little bits of
it. Fair.
Yeah, it's close to bottom 3 Pixar for me.
Ooh. Yeah, I can't go that far, but yeah, I think it's fine. I think it's perfectly fine. That's kind of where I'm at with it. It has some of my favorite Pixar marketing, though. I'll say that. The marketing was very good.
They're really good at their marketing in general.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the teasers for that movie were way better than the movie itself.
Yeah, and my last thought, I guess, because I could ramble on about 2013 forever.
Yeah, same.
2022 was the year of Colin Farrell, so I would be remiss if I didn't mention his best supporting turn in Saving Mr. Banks.
Oh, yeah. The best thing about that movie.
Very good.
It's a pretty cute movie. I think the movie's pretty good overall, but he's certainly my favorite thing in it.
Yeah, best supporting nominee at the InSession Film Awards in 2013.
Yeah.
For one J.D. Duran. So
going to bat for Saving Mr. Banks.
Yeah, gotta love it. All right, that's 2013, year that I'm fond of. Do you have any final thoughts? I think we can wind things down here a little bit.
I think we can wind things down and ask all of our listeners out there what their favorite film, or at least what they think the best film of 2013 is. And, coincidentally, we asked all of our listeners that with this week's poll. So let's go ahead and transition to those results.
It's real bad, okay? I don't like those numbers at all.
Just one poll? Those things aren't scientific.
Yes, they are. All this is science. This is math.
All right, for this week's poll, we asked all of you, what do you think is the best film of 2013? And JD, we got a lot of responses here. I think we had over 100 votes for this specific poll. And this is one of those years we didn't have, you know, the Pattinson fans hijacking the poll like they normally do. So it was actually very evenly distributed. It was a very fair poll. Do you want to try and guess this, or do you want me to just get to the results?
Wolf of Wall Street.
It's in the top 3, but it didn't win.
12 Years a Slave.
No, that didn't do very well.
Her? It's got to be Her then.
That was our winner.
Yeah.
At 16.8% was Her. In second place at 12.6%, Denis Villeneuve's Prisoners.
Oh, look at that! Take that, Brendan.
With,
Take that.
with the Wolf of Wall Street tying in third place for 11.7%, tied with Gravity. So that is the top 3/top 4 there. I should not have said anything that I'm not the biggest fan of Prisoners.
So now people are coming after you.
that was all in response. That was all forward thinking of our fans. Nice work, everyone out there. You knew what I was about to say, and you're trying to combat it right away.
That's funny.
Yeah, but we did get quite a few votes here for other films. We had a tie just after the third place option between Short Term 12 and Inside Llewyn Davis at 9.5%. 12 Years a Slave was actually underneath that at 7.5%. Still a few votes here and there for Nebraska, Before Midnight. We had 1 or 2 votes here and there for movies like American Hustle, Frances Ha, The World's End, This Is the End, Spring Breakers, Act of Killing, Blue is the Warmest Color. Blue Jasmine got a vote as well. But yeah, Spike Jonze coming in hot, and I normally don't always agree 100% with the poll, at least based on what I would pick as my winner versus what actually won. This time I do agree with it. I think Her is the best movie of this year.
Yeah, it's my number 2, as I noted earlier, but I still love it. It's one of the best films of the 2010s, so I'm glad to see it get a lot of love. Joaquin Phoenix, so good in that movie as well. Scarlett Johansson, lots of love there. I am definitely higher on Prisoners than you are. It's, you know, Denis Villeneuve is a filmmaker that I love and adore, that I have always loved. I hate that it's become somewhat trite, I guess, to become a Villeneuve head, but I can't help it. I've always loved his work.
I like his films a lot too. My problem with Prisoners is really the final 15 minutes.
Yeah.
I think up until that point, I think it's at least a 4-star movie.
Yeah. I think that's very fair. And I know we've had that debate. I do really like it. I guess I say all that to say it's still probably lesser Villeneuve for me, but I still like it. I'm definitely higher on it than you are.
That's fair.
That is for sure. To speak to Gravity real quick, I didn't really talk about this too much other than I mentioned that it sits at number 8 on my current list for my top 10 of 2013. And a lot of it circles back to 2 things. One, I love Alfonso Cuarón's direction.
Same, yeah.
I think it is really well crafted. And when it comes to the theatrical experience, I know we've talked a lot about Cameron recently with the release of The Way of Water.
Sure.
And this was, 4 years after the release of the first Avatar, right? Which came out in 2009, I believe.
Yes, that is correct.
So, you know, at that time, people were still talking about Avatar and the 3D experience that was Avatar. That was still a talking point because Gravity comes out in 3D, and I still think it's a better theatrical experience.
Yeah.
Not just in terms of the gripping intensity of Gravity. As a 3D experience, it doesn't have the visual lushness of Avatar, but I think Cuarón utilizes the 3D technology better than what Cameron did with that first Avatar.
Yeah, but isn't it also proof that other attributes that really have nothing to do with the technical side of it being a 3D movie also play into how successful it is at being a 3D movie? Because in the case of Gravity, I felt emotionally involved because of Sandra Bullock's performance.
I agree. Yeah.
So, and in a weird way, it kind of helps amplify what's good about the visual experience as well, which I don't get from that first Avatar. We talked about that when we reviewed The Way of Water. What's missing in that first Avatar is the connection that I have with its human characters.
Yeah.
And say what you will about Gravity as far as it being, a pretty sparse narrative and some of its symbolism being very on the nose.
It's very obvious. Yeah.
That's really my biggest problem with it. Like, like the whole like sleeping scene, the fact that it mirrors an umbilical cord and a rebirth thing. Like it's kind of laughable at times for me, if I'm being honest, but there is an emotional pull to that movie because of Sandra Bullock, and I do feel something while watching it.
No, I completely agree. And I don't really mind the obvious nature of the symbolism because the pathos of the film is sincere. It'd be one thing if it just didn't work, if the emotion was manufactured, the performance wasn't very good. At that point, the symbolism would just be tedious. I would be much lesser on the film. But because it is sincere, it is done very well, it is dramatically intense and riveting, that its obviousness does not bother me at all.
That's fair.
And some of our favorite filmmakers, like Terrence Malick, isn't always subtle. There's certain aspects of his films that are obvious. I still love his movies. Or even the Coens. Some of the stuff they do is quite obvious. And some of it isn't, And so Cuarón, his, evolution as a filmmaker, I think has followed that same trajectory. Yeah. And Gravity is just a very different experience than all of his other movies. And I like that diversity. So I like that he's doing something different.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you in that regard.
And I think he makes the symbolism work because the emotion is earned. And that's really the bottom line.
Which is what matters. Yeah.
And that's what matters. And as a 3D experience, I think he utilizes the technology impeccably.
Sure.
And to me, it still might be the best 3D experience I've ever had. The Way of Water was great. I don't know if I liked it better than Gravity as a 3D experience.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's a good point.
But, the lushness of Avatar, I will not deny. I'm not taking that away. I just think as a 3D experience, I don't know if I've experienced anything better. So Gravity is still in my top 10 as a result. And glad to see that it still gets some love out there with others
some
as well.
love there. Yep.
All right, with that, we will go ahead and wind down the show here for the final time.
Wow.
As we've done it.
I'm not crying. You're crying.
Well, that's a funny transition, Brendan, because I'm actually going to. I think we can forego the usual end of the show shenanigans here. I mean, obviously, go follow us on social media and follow us on Patreon, all that sort of stuff that we usually talk about. I just want to get to final thoughts because it is going to get a little sentimental. And I'd rather just jump to that. But Brendan, final thoughts on the show this week?
Well, I mean, it is very bittersweet. I mean, I sort of made fun of the symbolism in a movie like Gravity and its, meetings on rebirth when that's exactly what we're essentially doing. But it does make me, rethink a lot of things and really feel the urge to express a lot of gratitude for what we've done over the past 10 years. Maybe more like 9 years since I came on in 2014, but also major thanks and appreciation to you for trusting my voice in the first place. For many of our listeners out there who don't know the story, I'll say it here. We met through a mutual friend while we both lived in Lexington, Kentucky. I think I met you the few days before you were about to get married. It was or maybe a few weeks. I don't know if it was days. It could have been a few weeks, but you were about to get married, I think at the very least that same month that I met you. Or at least somewhere close to that.
Yeah.
And we met at West 6 Brewery in Lexington. You were there with Nate Parsons, your original partner in crime here at InSession Film. Yep. And our mutual friend introduced each other, or at least introduced me to you. And somehow the conversation just went on for like 3 hours. We talked about Spider-Man 2, Who knows whatever else we talked about? I wish I had a time machine to go back and just be a fly on the wall. Yeah. But needless to say, I'm so glad it happened in the way that it did. Weirdly serendipitous. They talk about serendipity being a real thing. I think this is evidence of it.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about that earlier in the show in terms of us reliving 2013, the year that we started doing this week, leading into next week as we transition into 10 years and then starting the next phase. The timing of the 2013 retrospective going into next week is just impeccable.
Agreed.
And yes, meeting you was very much the same way, because moving into 2014, without getting into too many details at this point, because Nate Parsons, my original partner in crime, had to leave the show at the end of that year. And I had a guy stepping in to help me with extra film and to, kind of fill in a little role while Nate left. And that left me in a little bit of a bind because I wasn't sure how extra film was going to function. And then you roll into my life, and it was like kind a godsend. Like
it's like,
it was
hey,
an answer
dude,
to prayer.
I know movies. I know some movies. Let's talk this stuff out.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy how that worked out. And then we get you on the show not long after that meetup, and everything is pretty much history after that. And it was
everything everywhere all at once, as they say.
Exactly. But yeah, it was really great timing. And then here we are 10 years later, and this is bittersweet. I was thinking about this earlier today, and as one does, getting emotional thinking about it, because
of course,
we've been doing it this way for a long time, and it's been you and I, sometimes with a guest. The last 5 years, Ryan and Jay have been a part of it as well. And we've gotten together, we've recorded it this specific way, in with audio being in mind first and foremost. And that's come with its burdens at times, because there's prep for the show, there's getting together to do the show, there's editing involved. And now with Sam getting older and a baby on the way, it's gotten to the point where a change is necessary. It's needed for me, but I've always loved doing this at the same time. So bittersweet is certainly the apt way to articulate it. I know in time I'm probably going to miss this, although moving forward into the next phase with Ryan and Jay and video and the flexibility of the new format.
And the fact that reviews are still not going away.
Yeah.
We can hop on and do reviews in their own way, as you're talking about, but it's gonna fuel our fire a little bit differently. And after 10 years of this, it's kind of needed for anything in life.
I agree. I think it's going to re-energize me in a lot of ways, and it's going to give me time. That is the biggest thing, is it's going to give me time to not be in the editing bay as much, to be with family, to be focused on work, and whatever it is that is in front of me, I'm going to have so much more flexibility, in addition to what I'm really looking forward to the most, and and spending time with you and Ryan and Jay every single week. And so there's a lot to look forward to, but doing it this way for 10 years and this being the end of that run has me feeling a certain way. We've been doing this for 10 years. It's just hard to believe. I've said that so many times and I still can't wrap my mind around it. It's just been a long time.
It's a shame we're states apart right now and we're doing this digitally, but just know I'm giving you a massive hug.
Well, I appreciate it, my friend. Certainly reciprocating that back. It's been a hell of a run, and do appreciate everyone that's listened to these shows as long as they've been. And this is going to be another long show, of course. It's only appropriate
it's
that we're
only in
ending
keeping.
this.
It's only in keeping, yeah.
Exactly.
So you want to know why we're changing things?
We gotta
this
go.
Is why.
Exactly. This is exactly why things have to be changed, because we can't help ourselves. So it's been a hell of a run these last 10 years doing it this way. I do want to thank Nate Parsons. I want to thank Scott Pollard for all his help early on.
Yeah.
Got to thank the late, great Blake Bertuzzi as well. And of course, you, Brendan, Ryan, and Jay, and our great listeners for anyone that's stuck around all of these years and listened to the show. Really do appreciate it. And we hope that you enjoy the next phase of InSession Film. I think the video is going to be a lot of fun. I think you're going to enjoy the banter. You'll enjoy it not being 3 hours each week. So you'll get some extra time.
Reasonable.
Yeah. So there's certainly a lot to look forward to. With all of that said, for the last time, as we've done it for 10 years, we will see you all next time on the InSession Film Podcast.
You do things your own way. You make things your own, just the way you like them. Your bank should do that for you too. The Bank of Clark is the bank for that. From banking to lending to wealth management. When you need financial services built just for you, we're the bank for that. Find out what banking designed just for you is all about. Call 1-800-650-8723. Visit your local Bank of Clark branch today or go to bankofclark.bank. That's bankofclark.bank. We're the bank for that. Member FDIC.